Do billionaires really give a rat's ass about woke issues? And I think this is a really important question, and I think it's important for Americans to understand this. There's actually a word, or actually it's two words, a phrase to describe what's going on here. And I'll get to that in just a minute, but just, you know, you're going to want to hear this. We have billionaires funding the Republican Party. I mean, hugely. Without billionaire funding in the GOP, they would shrivel up and blow away. And many Americans are wondering why. Why do billionaires believe, for example, or do we really believe, excuse me, for example, that a fossil fuel billionaire gives a rat's ass about whether a high school student in Florida learns that there are gay people in our world? Or that African Americans in Tennessee were once enslaved? Why do billionaires care about this? American billionaires, I mean, after all, they live in a very different world than you and me. They don't worry about crime. They live in gated mansions with private security 24/7. They don't need to interact with the riffraff like you and me when they travel. They're driven wherever they go in bulletproof limousines or on helicopters, and they fly private jets, so they don't even have to go through airport security or show their ID. I had lunch with a near billionaire a few years ago. He rented an entire restaurant for an entire day just so four of us could have a quiet lunch while his driver and security detail patrolled the nearby parking lots and empty streets. Dinner at one of the half-dozen billionaire-friendly restaurants in New York City, yes, there are some, typically starts around $800 a person, and that doesn't include tips, taxes, or drinks. The prices really doesn't reflect the cost of the food or even the service and the rent. It's to keep out the riffraff. Some of these restaurants, in fact, that cater to billionaires in New York City, and not just New York City, by the way, this is also true of Los Angeles and New York. Some of them don't even have names on the door. In fact, one of them in New York, the door is hidden behind a painting inside an office building, a real high-end office building. They have unlisted phone numbers. Their kids don't attend public schools or colleges. Their servants, their masseuses, their nannies, their mistresses, and their chefs often live on the grounds of their estates. When they vacation, they fly private jets to their private yachts that have enough staterooms to accommodate 100 of their closest friends. Just ask Clarence Thomas if you have any curiosity or doubts about that. So why do people like this give a damn about whether a trans girl wants to compete in public high school sports? Their kids don't go to public high schools. Why do they care whether a 10-year-old girl who gets raped by her uncle in Ohio can get an abortion? Why do they fund politicians making loud noises about the horrors of white children learning that their ancestors enslaved African American people? Why do they care about the rights of those kids' parents to own semi-automatic weapons? None of this stuff has any impact whatsoever on the lives of these billionaires. Why do they fund it? Why would any morbidly rich person in America give a damn about these so-called Republican social issues? Similarly, why would American industry favor politicians dedicated to a law in Texas that requires that this be posted in every public elementary school in type large enough to be read anywhere in the class, quote, "Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, nor his manservant, nor his maidservant, nor his ox, nor his ass"? Do they really want second graders taught about infidelity, gay and straight rape, and bestiality? Or, "I am the Lord thy God, a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children unto the third and fourth generations of them that hate me"? Do they really want school children taught about the thousands of people in the Bible who were slaughtered by God or at God's direction? Do wealthy businessmen who rarely even go to church fund politicians who demand these commandments? I mean, why? Actually, it turns out there's a very rational, albeit cynical, answer. American billionaires and the corporations that make them rich share a couple of big concerns that are well served by Republicans' ongoing culture wars and their embrace of fascist behavior and ideology. In fact, there's an entire field of academic scholarship dedicated to examining this dynamic. It's called diversionary warfare. When Henry V took the British throne in 1415, Many of the country's noblemen didn't recognize him because his father, Henry IV, had usurped the throne from its rightful holder, Richard II. So Henry quickly declared war on France, and within months he had succeeded at the Battle of Agincourt, and the country rallied around him. In April of 1982, Margaret Thatcher was facing a crisis of confidence after gutting the nation's social safety net and privatizing the railroads and things. So what did she do? She had and unemployment was at a record high. Her numbers were in the total tank. So what did she do? She declared war against Argentina around the Falklands. 255 British troops died, only 3 Argentinians. But hey, they won the war. On October 23rd, 1983, terrorists blew up a Marine barracks in Lebanon, killing 241 Americans and making Ronald Reagan, whose response was to cut and run, he pulled all our troops out, look like a coward and impotent. So taking a cue from Thatcher, 2 days later, Reagan bombed and invaded the tiny Caribbean island of Grenada, saying he was going to save 800 medical students. After that, his popularity numbers shot up. He had been below both Walter Mondale and John Glenn, his 2 most likely opposition candidates in the 1984 election. He had been way behind them. But after his war on Grenada, boom, his numbers went right up and he won the 1984 election. Most recently in 2001, George W. Bush. Nobody thought he was a legitimate president. His brother knocked 90,000 African Americans off the voting rolls in Florida, and he only won by 537 votes. So what does he do? 9/11 provides him with an opportunity to attack Iraq and Afghanistan, become a wartime president, even though Iraq and Afghanistan had nothing to do with 9/11. It was plotted in Germany and Florida, and it was run out of New York and Boston. But hey, it got him reelected. So this is what's going on. These Republicans are funding the culture wars to keep Republicans in power, because Republicans are going to give them what they want. I mean, this is an old song, right? This goes on for a long way back. So now we stand on a precipice. Are we going to continue to allow global warming to kill our people? Are we going to continue to let our teachers be intimidated by Nazis? Are we going to perpetuate the slaughter of our children from the highest gun ownership rates in the country? Are we going to keep young people chained to student debt? Are we going to let corporations continue to block workers from forming unions? Are we going to force American women into second-class status? Are we going to maintain police systems that routinely murder black people? Are we going to continue to look the other way while Republicans gut Social Security? Or are we going to create a world that works for all? It's up to us.
We say fight back!
In addition to bringing you the Thom Hartmann Program here on Free Speech TV and Video Media Online, we also have a whole set of ways you can interact with us and tools you can use to spread the word about the importance of democracy and the threats to it in our republic. First, there's your daily homework. Sue Nethercutt puts together a daily email newsletter that has a link to every story I discuss on the air, so you can find my sources and you can share them with your friends. It's free and you can sign up at thomhartmann.com. Second, I publish my daily take every day over at the hartmannreport.com website. That's also free if you want the daily 5 days a week rant in your inbox. No ads either. Third, we have the podcasts. There's the free 1-hour version of our daily show that's advertising supported. You can find that wherever you get your podcasts normally. And then there's also the podcast of the entire 3-hour show with no advertisements, and that's available by subscription over at thomhartmann.com. So check them all out at thomhartmann.com and hartmannreport.com. Today's book in our book club is The Hidden History of the War on Voting, Who Stole Your Vote and How to Get It Back, by this guy, Thom Hartmann. This is from chapter 1, or from the introduction, actually. In 2016, 6% of Americans who were eligible to vote nominated Donald Trump as the GOP's presidential candidate. It was 8% for Hillary Clinton on the Democratic side. Trump went on to be elected president by 26% of eligible voters. The modern American oligarchs have largely stayed in power using 3 simple elements: explicit and overt racism, massive disinformation campaigns, and voter suppression. No ideas, no push for better schools, hospitals, airports, roads, or bridges, or reform of our health, energy, or financial systems. No promise of more and better jobs. None of these staples of past presidential campaigns can be found in pretty much any Republican advertising today. Instead, the public Republican message is all about race, or the subset of race, religion. Muslim stands in for brown Arab in GOP speak, and immigration, aka brown people from south of our border, and socialism. Meanwhile, Republican secretaries of state across the nation are vigorously purging voters from the rolls. Over 17 million, more than 10% of America's active voters, in just the 2016-2018 period, according to NBC News. After the 5 Republican appointees on the U.S. Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act in 2013, 14 GOP-controlled states moved within a year, some within days, to restrict access to the vote, particularly for communities of color, students, and retired people. In North Carolina, for example, 158 polling places were permanently closed in the 40 counties with the most African-American voters just before the 2016 election, leading to a 16% decline in African-American early voting in that state. An MIT study found that nationwide, Hispanic voters wait 150% longer in line than white voters, and black voters can expect to wait 200% longer in line to vote. In Indiana, then Governor Mike Pence's new rigorous voter ID law caused an 11.5% drop in African-American voting. Students are suing for their right to vote, and retired people who no longer drive but care passionately about their Social Security and Medicare are being turned away at the polls by the hundreds of thousands because their driver's licenses have expired. The obvious failure of 40-plus years of Reaganomics and GOP policies to maintain a functional middle class in America has been a problem for the modern GOP. In 1974, for example, the GOP had outright control of only 7 states. The message, elect us and we'll help the rich people, just didn't generally resonate with American voters. It's the reason why, outside of the fluke elections of 46 and 52, Democrats controlled the House of Representatives outright for 3 generations, from 1933 to 1996, and controlled the Senate for most of that time. Desperate to win the presidency for the GOP in 1968, Richard Nixon went so far as to commit treason by torpedoing a peace deal with President Lyndon Johnson that President Lyndon Johnson had worked out with the North and South Vietnamese. According to Abul Hassan Bani Sadr, then president of Iran, Ronald Reagan did the same thing by cutting a deal with Iran whereby they would hold on to the U.S. embassy hostages until after the 1980 presidential election, torpedoing Jimmy Carter's chances of re-election. But in 2000, the GOP changed tactics. After Reagan was almost busted for his part in Iran-Contra, he testified that he had forgotten about details of the program more than 80 times. His growing Alzheimer's spared him an indictment. They realized that getting busted for treason wasn't worth the risk. They needed a plan B, and it was deliciously simple. If most voters don't like what you're selling, then just don't let them vote. Paul Weyrich promoted this idea back in 1980 when he was campaigning for Reagan after co-founding the Heritage Foundation. And indeed, many Republican luminaries, such as William Rehnquist, who went from serving the GOP by standing in polling places and intimidating Hispanic and Native American voters in the 1960s, to becoming Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, rose up through the ranks by participating in Republican-run voter intimidation schemes. Voter suppression became the foundational go-to tactic for the GOP in 2000. Although the GOP attacked Democratic presidential nominee Al Gore with smear and innuendo, ridiculing him for helping write the legislation that created the modern internet, for example, the main thing that got George W. Bush into the White House was voter suppression. his brother, Florida Governor Jeb Bush, and Bush's Secretary of State, Katherine Harris, threw somewhere between 20,000 and 90,000 African-American voters off the rolls. They were able to get the vote close enough. The 5 Republican appointees to the Supreme Court functionally awarded Bush the presidency. The BBC covered this in 2001 in 2 major investigative reports that were seen all over the world, except on any American media. By 2016, the Republican Party had fine-tuned its voter suppression and intimidation systems to the point that they ran like well-oiled machines in nearly 30 states. Between the 2012 and 2016 presidential elections, for example, Ohio had purged more than 2 million voters from its rolls, the vast majority, more than 2 to 1, in heavily African-American and Hispanic counties. The 5 Republican appointees on the Supreme Court ruled in 2017 that they could keep it up.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Hey, happy Tuesday. It's the official rolling out of President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris's re-election campaign. In fact, she is featured, I think, about a dozen times in his campaign video. Solid endorsement of her and a solid presentation of himself. I'm very hopeful that this is going to work out well. I mean, there's still a year and a half to go. A lot can happen in a year and a half, but good luck, President Biden, is all I have to say. I wish him well. We are 100% behind him. On our program today, how to dethrone the self-appointed kings and queens of America. I'll get into that in a moment. Also, will Tucker Carlson run for president and challenge Trump in the Republican primary? And if so, will he be the next authoritarian president of the United States if he were to win? And is a Georgia prosecutor, Fani Willis, ready to indict Donald Trump? It's looking like it. I'll tell you about that in just a few minutes. At the top of our second hour, Ralph Nader is going to drop by. They've got a new newspaper in Washington, D.C. he's talking about. Also, how Republicans are silencing their constituents in our second hour. And Republican snowflakes can't handle unique artwork, so it's being destroyed, huh? We'll talk about that in the second hour. In the third hour, a Florida school district bans dozens of books based on proposed legislation. And there's a very weird guy behind all this stuff. I'll tell you about that and him. Also, suddenly the Republican Party wants to pack some courts. This is down in Texas. I'll tell you about that. It's an amazing story. And can French fries bring on depression? This is an amazing little bit of science that has to do with a chemical called acrylamide. And I'll give you all the details on that in the third hour of our program. But I want to start out with my rant today over at HartmannReport.com, how to dethrone the self-appointed kings and queens of America. You know, actually, I'm going to come back to that. I want to start out by talking about Tucker Carlson. Rick Wilson is a former Republican strategist. He has written an anti-Trump book. He has essentially left the Republican Party. And, you know, he's a regular contributor on MSNBC. And he had some really interesting things to say about Tucker Carlson that I think are worth sharing with you. Tucker turns 54 next month. He's a young guy. He would be, you know, kind of in the category of John Kennedy's age. And Rick Wilson says, I wouldn't count on the Tucker Carlson White Power Hour showing up on the Blaze or the Daily Wire anytime soon. Why? Because almost certainly Tucker Carlson has a huge non-compete agreement written into his contract with Fox so-called News. Which means, you know, if this is the case, and we don't know yet for sure, but it's common, it's normal over there. What that means is that, Tucker's going to be looking for a job. Yesterday we were talking about this, and I was speculating, where's he going to go? What's he going to do? And I told you, that Louise was saying to me, he's going to run for president. And I was saying, nah, no way. Well, Rick Wilson agrees with my wife. He says he's rich enough, He'd instantly have an online fundraising juggernaut second only to Trump and perhaps surpassing him. He's polarizing. He's terrible. He's utterly amoral. In short, better than Ron DeSantis for the base. Rick Wilson goes on to say, I'd argue he's the only Republican who presents a material danger to Donald Trump in a primary. Keep in mind that Donald Trump became president not because of any political background. I mean, he had been a lifelong Democrat. In fact, he only became a Republican in the year before he ran for the in the Republican presidential primary. It wasn't politics that got Trump ultimately into the White House. It was celebrity. NBC had taught him how to do television. He himself had, through a lifetime, had learned how to manipulate media. A very media savvy guy. And NBC created this showcase for Donald Trump. They turned him into a celebrity by portraying him as an extraordinarily successful businessman. In fact, he's a massively failed businessman in most regards. I mean, he's had either 5 or 6 bankruptcies. He stole hundreds of millions of dollars from his siblings and his relatives, at least according to allegations from his niece and others in his family. His father had to bail out his casino, for God's sake, walking in and buying, a whole pile of chips. I think it was $1 million worth of chips. I'd have to go back and look at the amount. And then just leaving the chips there as just a way of basically laundering money into Trump's casinos. Who loses money on casinos? Donald Trump. His Trump steaks failed, his Trump wine failed, his Trump water failed, his Trump the board game failed, his Trump University not only failed, but he was prosecuted for fraud and convicted and had to pay a $25 million restitution. About the only thing that Donald Trump has ever been successful at are his real estate deals, and that's in large part because real estate is so unregulated in the United States that it's the principal way that Russian oligarchs launder their money, and apparently a lot of it through Donald Trump's properties. So, Trump has been running a money laundering machine for years. He's been apparently successful at that. But, it was celebrity that got Trump into the White House. Well, who has more celebrity on the right now than Tucker Carlson? I mean, he's more famous than Ron DeSantis. In fact, Ron DeSantis premised his run for the White House on being able to get Tucker Carlson's endorsement. Now, he ultimately didn't get it, but, or maybe, I'm not sure that Tucker Carlson has actually endorsed anybody so far. If you know, let me know. I'm not a regular Tucker Carlson viewer. But the bottom line is, for Republicans, they don't care what your policy positions are, with any kind of level of nuance or concern. They just want to know that you basically, hate people of color and Jews and immigrants, and that you support the possibility of a racial war, that you think, white Americans should be arming up, that you support tax cuts for billionaires. That gets you the support of the billionaire class. And Tucker Carlson is, certainly a multi-millionaire, and maybe more. I don't know. He's the heir to the Swanson frozen fortune, or an heir to it. So celebrity and money are the things that make you popular in the Republican, on the Republican side. So what do you think? Do you think that there's a real chance that Tucker Carlson could play a serious role? And if so, what would that role be? What kind of impact would a Tucker Carlson candidacy have on this race? Could he beat Joe Biden? Could he beat Donald Trump in the primary, for that matter? I mean, there's a lot of questions here. Not any simple answers. But as Rick Wilson says, celebrity, money, mental acuity, cynicism, pro-Putin isolationism, and an overt threat of authoritarianism are pretty strong sauce, secret sauce for the MAGA base. celebrity got Trump the White House, it could certainly do the same for Tucker. Interesting. Also, I'm curious your thoughts on President Biden running and how he can best do that. It's 15 minutes past the hour.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
I rant on the Supreme Court on the other side of this break. Stay tuned. And, this is interesting. The Bank of America has cut short a conference that they were holding, an online conference. This was in the Financial Times, by the way, a couple days ago. It was a securities conference. And they canceled 3 sessions because of some of the comments being made by one of the speakers. This was Timothy Ash of Blue Bay Asset Management. He's a Russia specialist. And he said, I still don't get why U.S. banks still wheeled out speakers at events for clients who so often roll through Moscow's talking points of the war on Ukraine. One of the people who was present at this event, I mean, this is amazing. Why would Bank of America put up speakers to trash talk American involvement in Ukraine? One of the people who was present at the event said it was more like a Bank of Russia than Bank of America. The whole event was overwhelmingly pro-Russian. Another person described Tuesday's sessions as relentlessly anti-Ukrainian. 2 people on the call said Daniel Sheehan, Bank of America's Securities Senior Vice President for International Relations, was critical of Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky, describing him as a, quote, master manipulator and mimic, about whom there are, quote, serious concerns in the U.S. administration. A spokesman for Zelensky did not immediately comment. One of those present said that they felt one speaker, Nikolai Petro, a professor of political science at the University of Rhode Island, quote, said stuff that was absolutely shocking. It was straight out of the foreign ministry of Russia. Petro's remarks included, quote, under any scenario, Ukraine would be the overwhelming loser in the war. Its industrial capacity would be devastated, partly by its economic policy of becoming an agricultural superpower, quote, as recommended by the EU and the United States, and its population would continue to shrink. He said, if this is what Russia meant by removing Ukraine's capacity to wage war against Russia, then it will arguably have won. What are Western banks doing, weighing in on weird stuff like this? I mean, on these things. I don't get it. Anyhow, picking up your calls here, Shay in Jacksonville, Florida. Hey, Shay, thanks for watching us on YouTube. What's on your mind today?
Hi, Tom. Good afternoon, everyone. Tom, I agree with you in part, but I also wanted to add something. I kind of disagree with the premise that the Republicans only look for people who, hate blacks and Jews and transgender. They also hate white people who don't agree with them.
That's a good point.
Think that, I really think this is about an ideological position and a worldview that they have, that they must dominate, anyone who does not agree with them. And that's where we're missing it. And we have to be more inclusive in our conversation and our description because, abolitionists were killed. The, people who helped to fight for civil rights. Just recently, the white man who was engaged to the black woman, Heather Heyer, Mm-hmm. So we have to be, we have to be more inclusive.
Yeah, okay, good point. It's not just Jews and people of color, it's also their white allies. Good point. Shay, thank you. Thank you for pointing that out.
It's all of us.
I'll include that in my rhetoric going forward. I appreciate it. It is 19 minutes past the hour. We'll be right back. Change starts with you. You can be calling your Democratic or Republican representatives to let them know what you think by calling 202-224-3121. It's the Capitol switchboard. It'll get you right through to them. So we have this major culture war going on in the United States. You've got Republicans trying to ban abortion. They're trying to ban books. Not just trying to, they're actually doing all of these things. Banning books, banning trans girls in sports, attacking basically the entire queer community. Whatever they can to try to sow division and hate, promoting Nazi memes, talking about how, Jews are paying to have black and brown people replace white people and all this kind of stuff. Why are billionaires doing this? Why are they funding these people? I mean, billionaires don't care about crime. They live in gated communities with private security. They don't care about public schools. Their kids go to private schools. They don't care about public transportation. They fly in private jets. Oh, yeah, that's right. If they can get us fighting against each other, if they can get us hating each other, we will ignore their efforts to cut their taxes and deregulate their industries. There's a whole video about it at tom.tv. Check it out. Alrighty, welcome back. The Supreme Court. When the Supreme Court was created with the Judiciary Act of, I think it was 1791, maybe it was 1790 even, the United States was created in its modern form in 1789 when the Constitution was ratified. When this happened, the Supreme Court did not have the power to overturn laws. They couldn't say, no, we believe that that law is unconstitutional and therefore it's toast. They didn't have the power to make up law. They couldn't decide, for example, Roe v. Wade coming up with, well, actually it was the subsequent case that came up with the three trimesters. I'm forgetting the name of the case, but you know what I'm talking about. And developing an idea, for example. This was not envisioned by the founders, or at least the framers of the Constitution. And Alexander Hamilton laid that out in some detail in the Federalist Papers, that the Supreme Court was the final court of appeals. You sue me for something and you win, I appeal it, I win, then you appeal my appeal and you win. And then, ultimately there's got to be a court somewhere that says, okay, here's who actually won. End of discussion. World without end, amen. And that court is the Supreme Court. So, with regard to both civil and criminal activities. So that's the main purpose of the Supreme Court. Now, it has a secondary purpose in that it adjudicates disputes between the states and between the United States and foreign countries. But there's no mention in the Constitution of the Supreme Court knocking down laws based on constitutionality, or, for example, gutting the Voting Rights Act and saying, oh, no, we think that this part of the Voting Rights Act doesn't comport with the Constitution, or saying that everybody should be able to have a gun because of the Constitution, or saying that women shouldn't be able to get an abortion because of the Constitution. It wasn't there. It was put into law in 1803 by the court itself in a case called Marbury versus Madison. And basically, there was that case and Dred Scott in 1856. And those are the only two cases, really, in the first 100 years of America, the first 70 years of America, where this kind of judicial review was practiced by the court. Since then, though, or largely since the Nixon administration, when the right-wingers on the court took over, the court, although it's been most of the 20th century and even large chunks of the last 3 decades of the 19th century, the court's been knocking down laws left and right. I have ranted in the past about how Congress should simply take this power away from them through court stripping. I'm moderating my position here somewhat with this op-ed. And what I'm suggesting is that Congress should pass a law to regulate the court, a power that they're given in Article 3, Section 2. And that regulation of the court should simply say that the court can make a decision as the court of final appeal based on a majority decision. But when they make a decision based on their interpretation of the Constitution, it must be a consensus decision. It must be unanimous. What this would do is instantly strip from the court any semblance of partisanship. Because you're going to have Democratic nominees and Republican nominees having to agree that something is, in fact, truly unconstitutional. That's a big deal. And this is, by the way, this is not an altogether radical idea. There are, other countries that do this. I'm looking for my list here. Belgium, France, and Italy work this way. This is not a new idea. In Belgium, in France, and in Italy, for their Supreme Courts to make a decision based on constitutionality, the decision must be unanimous. And in Germany and Spain, the court does that, not by law, but by tradition. So here you have 5 of the most, democratic countries in the world. I mean, nobody would argue that Belgium, France, Italy, Germany, and Spain are fascist dictatorships or weird. And they're all already doing this, and it works really well, and they've been doing it for centuries. In the case of France, this goes back almost as far as the United States. So I'm putting this out there in the hopes that, some legislators will take it seriously, that, senators will read it. I encourage you, if you like this idea, I've tweeted it, I've posted it on basically every social media out there. And, feel free to repost my article, wherever you have posting rights. You may repost it at Daily Kos or Democratic Underground or wherever you want. Just link back to the original article. That's all I ask. Don't worry about fair use. You have my permission. This is an idea that I think his time has come. If you think I'm nuts on this or I'm wrong on this, I'd love to hear from you. But it seems to me like this would resolve a lot of issues. I mean, this power of the court to overturn laws has been huge. I mean, on both sides. And it has done mostly just kind of torn this country apart.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
It turns out Neil Gorsuch is apparently hustling money from selling land just like Clarence Thomas was and hiding the source of it. Amazing. Today is The Poisoned City, Flint's Water and the American Urban Tragedy by Anna Clark. This is from the prologue. On a hot day in the summer of 2014 in the Civic Park neighborhood where Pastor R. Sherman McCathern preached in Flint, Michigan, water rushed out of a couple of fire hydrants. Puddles formed on the dry grass and splashed the skin of the delighted kids who ran through it. But the spray looked strange. The water was coming out dark as coffee for hours, McCathern remembered. The shock of it caught in his throat. Something is wrong here. Something had been wrong for months. That spring, Flint, under the direction of state officials, turned off the darkening water that it had relied on for the drinking water that it had relied on for nearly 50 years. The city planned to join a new regional system called the Carignan-Nondy Water Authority, and while it waited for the KWA to be built, it began bringing in its water from the Flint River. McCathern didn't pay much attention to the politicking around all this. He had enough to worry about with his busy parish. But after the switch, many of his neighbors grew alarmed at the water that flowed from their kitchen faucets and shower heads. They packed public meetings, wrote questioning letters, and protested at City Hall. They filled clear plastic bottles in their taps to show how the water looked brown or orange and sometimes had particulates floating in it. Showering seemed to be connected with skin rashes and hair loss. The water smelled foul. A sip of it put the taste of a cold metal coin on your tongue. But the authorities said everything was all right and you could drink it, so people did, McCathern said later. Residents were advised to run their faucets for a few minutes before using the water to get a clean flow. But as the months went by, the city plant tinkered with treatment and issued a few boil water advisories. State environmental officials said again and again that there was nothing to worry about. The water was just fine. Whatever their senses told them, whatever the whispers around town, whatever Flint's troubled history with powerful institutions telling them what was best for them, this wasn't actually hard for people like McCathern to believe. Public water systems are one of this country's most heroic accomplishments, a feat so successful that it's almost invisible. By making it a commonplace for clean water to be delivered to homes, businesses, and schools, we have saved untold lives from what today sound like antiquated diseases in a Charles Dickens novel: cholera, dysentery, typhoid fever. Here in Flint, it was instrumental in turning General Motors, founded in 1908 in Vehicle City, as the town was known, into a global economic giant. The advancing underground network of pipes defined the growing city and its metropolitan region, which boasted of being home to one of the strongest middle classes in the entire United States. McCathern is a tall, bald man with a thin mustache and a scratchy rasp in his baritone voice. At the time of the water switch, he had led the non-denominational Joy Tabernacle Church for about 15 years. It was founded in the YMCA in downtown Flint, where it held baptisms in the swimming pool. But in 2009, it made a home in Civic Park, where a Presbyterian church closed after 85 years and gave its sanctuary over to the young and hopeful congregation. By then, Civic Park, one of America's oldest subdivisions, was a desert of deserted, historically significant homes, the pastor said. Built between 1917 and 1919 by General Motors and DuPont and Company, along curving tree-lined boulevards, the tidy houses were designed for Flint's auto workers and their families. But over the years, the neighborhood was blighted by vacancy. Empty 2 stories with lurching front porches and crumbling roofs sat alongside crisply painted homes where Flint residents, they sometimes call themselves Flintoids or Flintstones, still live their lives. When the sound of gunshots on the street outside interrupted services, McCathern gave a nod to the church musicians, urging them to play louder. Some called Joy Tabernacle a thug church, he said, but McCathern saw the good. The young men filling his pews built a proud society, if not by getting their names on the honor roll, then by tagging their names with spray paint. In the end, people just want to be seen. The ghosts of the past went well beyond Civic Park. Between General Motors and the United Auto Workers, the city had been a flourishing hub for American innovation. There were more than 100 different manufacturing establishments in town. 10 of them employed at least 1,000 people each. And they not only made automobiles, but paints, varnishes, tools, dyes, cotton, textiles, and a wealth of other products. Flint had one of the highest per capita incomes in the entire nation. And despite being severely segregated, it was a magnet for African-American migrants from the South. When Vice President Hubert Humphrey stopped by during the campaign for the 1964 election, he praised Flint for, quote, zooming ahead with unbelievable growth and progress. Workers earned wages that are very good, Humphrey said, and, quote, because of the great labor management program in the community over many years, there has been a constant rise in the standard of living, end quote. Away from the assembly lines and the executive suites, the people of Flint felt that the city just shouldn't be a place to work. It should also be a place to thrive. Charles Stewart Mott, an auto pioneer who became GM's single largest stockholder and 3-term mayor, created a nationally renowned community schools program that provided education, skills building workshops, and social influence and social services. The book, The Poison City.
And translated from the German. Did you know that every weekday we send out an email before the show giving you all the topics coming up so you can be fully informed and ready to interact with our program? Or that after the show we send out Sue's Stack, a list of every topic I've discussed along with clickable hot links to every source of information I've shared with you on the air? It's all completely free and available over at thom.tv, THOM.tv. Check it out. Jury selection just started in the rape trial, Donald Trump's E. Jean Carroll rape trial. She is one of about 20 women who have accused him of sexual assault. NPR has a complete list of them. It's pretty startling. This is going to be interesting. I wanted to just put a pin in my rant about Tucker Carlson, and then I'll pick up your phone calls here. Tucker Carlson has been studying
how autocracies work. This guy isn't just a talk show host. He went to Hungary and sat at the feet of Viktor Orban, had him on his program, learned from him how do you convert a European democracy into a Russia-aligned autocracy. He understands this probably better than Donald Trump does, probably better than Ron DeSantis does, frankly. Ron DeSantis is like, kind of running this little robotic thing. Tucker Carlson understands the media, he understands the power, he understands the politics, he understands the fascism, and he apparently loves it. There are, there's speculation that he's been trying to get onto his program now for some time, Vladimir Putin. I mean, it's like there's all kinds of warning signs here that, in my mind, make Tucker Carlson more of a threat than most Republicans, frankly. And if you think of Charles Lindbergh, I don't know if you saw the HBO special or the HBO drama series about the 1940s and this Jewish family during the 1930s, during the rise of Lindbergh and the Nazi movement in the United States. It's truly worth watching. And, Lindbergh, another person who was, parlaying his celebrity into the possibility of running for political office. He ultimately didn't. But there was a huge movement to draft him. Will Republicans start demanding that Tucker Carlson be drafted, that he be allowed to run for president? What do you think? And if so, what kind of impact will it have on America? So, picking up your calls here, Mark in South Bend, Indiana. Hey, Mark, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom, great show. The first caller called in, the young lady, was wonderful in what she said about, not making absolutes, that Republicans just hate blacks and Jews. And, Clarence Thomas right now is one of the most prominent black Republicans there is, Kanye West and that. So the other thing I want to mention is Paul, on Tucker Carlson running. I hope he does. I like what you said. I hope he runs and just blows Trump and DeSantis and everyone else away. That'd get Joe Biden off his horse. That'd get him to get more progressive. I'm glad Robert F. Kennedy is running. He had an excellent campaign segment on C-SPAN Sunday. It was very good. And I think we need to get more progressive candidates to run on the Democratic side.
Yeah. Bobby Kennedy
Joe needs to go.
He may have some progressive positions, but his anti-vax stance and his weird conspiracy mongering just make it impossible for me to even consider voting for him. But okay, I get your point, Mark. Mark, thank you for the call. Mark in Portland, Oregon. Hey, Mark, what's on your mind?
I think an even scarier scenario for the 2024 is if Donald Trump were to win the GOP nomination and then Tucker Carlson is added as his VP. I mean, that would just be a horrific tandem, because talk about just exciting the base even more.
Yeah.
An old fascist and a young fascist. And that would just be an incredible, scary scenario. I hope people are listening about that, because Tucker Carlson knows the media. He knows how to manipulate. He knows how to twist. Any TV that he gets is good TV for him, whether it's even bad TV. But he always seems to know how to use it to his advantage. And but I think that would be a horrific scenario if that should happen. So,
yeah,
what are your thoughts?
I agree, and I think that a Trump Carlson ticket or a DeSantis Carlson ticket or a Carlson DeSantis ticket, or God only knows. I mean, even all of them are major threats to the future of democracy in the United States. If Tucker Carlson is anywhere near it, and he will be near whoever the Republican nominee is, I guarantee you that. He's going to be sticking to that person like glue. And these people are open fascists. These people do not believe in democracy in the United States. They want to turn America into a full-blown oligarchy, a police state.
and it's, go ahead.
I'm reminded of that movie, A Face in the Crowd with Andy Griffith, that came out in the mid-'50s or whatever it was. Just the scary populism that the right wing can generate is just incredibly scary.
Yeah.
So I recommend that people watch that movie again and just see the power that these right-wing populists can actually attract, and just keep pushing progressive ideas.
Which movie is that you're talking about?
A Face in the Crowd.
Oh, A Face. I never saw that. That's an old one, right?
Yeah, it's in like the 1950s or so. It's really good. I mean, Andy Griffith's an incredible actor in that movie, but just completely shows you how an unknown radio type can get popular and then suddenly runs for office, and it's just, holy cow. It's just, but that's the thing that Carlson has. He's got the media, and that's just what's ultimately very.
Yeah, it's interesting. In fact, it makes you wonder. I mean, there's speculation that the reason Carlson got canned was because he said some really nasty things about Fox management that came out in the Dominion lawsuits. His executive producer was also canned at the same time, and so there's some speculation that there's this lawsuit from another one of their producers that the two of them were kind of ganging up on her and being very sexist and all this kind of stuff. That's a possibility. But maybe Murdoch just got wind that Tucker was thinking of running for higher office. Who knows? Mark, thank you. Thank you very much for that call. But this is 3 Marks in a row. Mark in Sauk City, Wisconsin. Hey, Mark, what's on your mind today?
Yeah, and unfortunately, I'm not in Sauk City, Wisconsin right now. That I'm doing the rehab thing, but it's just I like what you're saying there. And it's interesting that these strict constructionists on the Supreme Court right now that want to adhere strictly to the Constitution ignore the fact that Hamilton pointed out that there's no direct enumeration in the Constitution as the power of the Supreme Court to overturn law. They're frequently, they say, well, Congress doesn't have the power to do that. And Madison gave life to the whole enumeration thing that we might be called upon. Congress might be called upon to do things that aren't directly enumerated because you can't foresee all the problems you have.
Right. It's the Ninth Amendment.
It just seems odd that we have members on the Supreme Court right now that want to ignore the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, as well as the 16th Amendment to the Constitution. That they say, well, they don't like those, but that's a document they took an oath to.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that we have to hold these. Sounds like Gorsuch, not to. We have to hold the Supreme Court to the standards that are set forth in the Constitution in terms of good behavior, because anytime you're not disclosing your assets and your profits and let's face it, bribes that you are taking, that you're in violation of the good behavior part of the Constitution.
Right. And the Constitution, Article 3, does say that Supreme Court justices shall serve during times of good behavior.
This is bad behavior.
Yeah.
And also, there's not directly enumerated in the Constitution that they have life terms. I mean,
actually, it is.
Constructionists.
It does say that federal judges have life terms. That's in the Constitution.
But does it say the Supreme Court members have life terms?
Well, they're members of the federal bench. So, yes.
At
the time that the Constitution was written, there was no Supreme Court, and there were no federal courts. They had to be brought into being by law. The Article 3 authorizes Congress to bring the court system into being by law, and Congress did that. But the terms, but it has to be done within the framework.
Of good behavior.
Yeah, of good behavior. The judges, both of the Supreme and inferior courts, shall hold their offices during good behavior and shall at stated times receive for their services compensation. Blah, 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 blah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think we're in terms now. We are in the terms how Hamilton closes out the Federalist Papers, that there's enemies to our general national government in any form at all, and they're trying to bring it down. Like, I don't have my copy of the Federalist Papers with me, but I mean he actually says that there is a threat to our national government in terms of that, and in terms of rewriting the whole Constitution as well. He gives warning to that as well in Federalist 85 that that he knew he didn't have it perfect, but he knew that new attempts to rewrite the whole Constitution are threats to our general national government and the republic as a whole.
Yeah, there's that whole stretch from Federalist 78 through 85 or thereabouts, where Hamilton's talking about the courts and whatnot. That's really worth reading. Mark, thank you. Thank you very much for the call. It's coming up on 15 minutes before the hour. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
Speaking the truths the GOP would really rather you didn't know. I'll be right back with more of your calls. And welcome back. Kent in Palos Verdes, California, listening on KPFK. Hey, Kent, what's on your mind today?
Hey, how you doing? I'm going to quote the Economist here about Donald Trump and real estate. You said that he was good at real estate. You know, he's not really particularly good at real estate either. He made approximately $250 million from The Apprentice, and with that money, he went around the world buying golf courses, and as it turns out, those golf courses are actually all taking losses prior to their depreciation, which is absolutely colossal. Now, if you actually take a look at his real estate, the real estate that works is really his building in downtown Manhattan, of course, which was manipulated by Roy Cohn and financed by his father. So he's really done nothing on his own. Now, the way he floats his lifestyle is his father was actually one of the richest men in America at the time. And he created an empire of over 20,000 low-income apartment units that are the bread and butter of the Trump existence.
Right.
So, I mean...
It's subsidized by the federal government.
Really isn't... Well, yeah, I mean, low-income housing is funded by HUD.
Yeah.
So the man really isn't good at anything. Now, and I take kind of personal offense to that because I'm into real estate myself and I work hard on it and I make it work. And so when I hear people say that, oh, he's a real estate magnate, it's like, no, he's actually not.
Okay.
So the other thing I'd like to say is, I'd like to push back on you a little bit. When your listening audience disregards the Republican Party fundamentally as being haters, they kind of ignore the fact that about 30% of Americans are by nature kind of Republican. And
authoritarian, anyway.
By them, well, there you go, Tommy.
No, I'm serious. That's.
No, please, let me just finish my thought. So, how does that explain them getting continually close to 50 or maybe a little bit more than 50% of the vote? Because the fact of the matter is, most Republicans, most people, you know, who vote that way are actually more interested in the policy than they are in the hyperbole. And that's how people like Trump kind of come into being. His hyperbole, you know, that's a little bit of red meat for the base. But guys like McMaster and other serious Republicans, you know, take a look at his policies, and that's how Republicans get their traction. So,
for example,
I just like to respond one thing to your first caller who said that, like, you know, Republicans are nothing but haters. You know, it's so simplistic. It's naive. And this is why Hillary lost the election, for her comment about the deplorables. As long as Democrats are discounting Republicans as being haters, they're going to continually be in a cat fight or a dog fight.
I'm not believing that lost Hillary the election. Hillary won that election by 3 million votes. I get it. The 70,000 votes in 3 states flipped the Electoral College, and that only happened after millions of dollars was spent via Facebook from Russia, you know, to influence those votes in those states. And in fact, the head of Trump's campaign, Paul Manafort, was funneling secret polling information right to Russian intelligence during that period of time. I don't disagree with you that we should take this more seriously than just writing them off as haters. Ken, thank you for the call. It's coming up on 10 minutes before the hour. Help support progressive radio. If you're listening to us on a commercial station, call their advertisers and let them know you're listening. If you're listening to us on Pacifica, or one of our many nonprofit stations, please support them when they do their fundraising drives. Thanks for supporting progressive talk radio, and tag you're it. When I was a little kid, my grandmother had a piano, and I loved to play it. I was incompetent, but I was figuring out all kinds of stuff. And then I kind of got away from it, and, went to school and things got busy and just lost track of it. Well, now there's this fascinating new study out of the University of Geneva, Switzerland, that is making me think maybe I should go back and learn the piano. What they found was that they took a group of 132 healthy older adults, retired, 62 to 78 years old. Half of them learned the piano, half of them took music classes without learning the piano. And what they found was that those who learned the piano actually had the strongest increase in their memory, in their mental competence, their mental faculties. Those who took the music classes also did well, but learning the piano was a huge step. So check it out. There's a whole video about it with all the details over at tom.tv. 10 minutes before the hour, picking up your calls. Mark in Valley, Washington. Hey, Mark, what's on today?
Well, first off, I think Tucker Carlson would be even worse than Trump.
Yeah, my point.
Now, your thing with the unanimous vote for Supreme Court justices. I think that might work in protecting existing laws, but I think it might be a nightmare for protecting states, because all they would need is a Amy Coney Barrett or somebody even worse they know is never going to say this is an unconstitutional law, and just ram it through the state. Where do you go from there then?
Well, then you go back to, when George Mason asked Thomas Jefferson if the Supreme Court isn't the final arbiter of what's constitutional, who is? And Jefferson's answer, which became the title of Larry Kramer's book, he was the dean of the Stanford Law School, when he was basically saying the same thing I'm saying here. Jefferson's answer was the people themselves. That if the state of Ohio is passing laws that are blatantly unconstitutional, the people eventually rise up and say no. Or you get all the members of the Supreme Court.
Yeah, but that's only if the fascism doesn't take hold fast enough.
See, here's the thing: the fascism is being advanced by the conservative majority on the court right now. I'm trying to slow them down.
I understand
and
that.
6-3. It's going to be that way it's going to be that way until long after I'm dead. So I
think we just need to expand the court.
Well, I'm not opposed to that either. And in fact, in my article, I mentioned there's a whole bunch of different options: term limits, expanding the court, et cetera. This thing with the unanimous vote, it just scares me, because all it would take is one radical judge, and they could block all sorts of unconstitutional laws from being overturned. Well, again, you're assuming that the court is protecting us against unconstitutional laws. I don't see the court as doing that. I see the court using the rubric of constitutionality to change laws that they don't like.
Well, that's Congress's job to rein that in.
My point, exactly. And I also noted that if you get enough members of Congress who are willing to regulate the Supreme Court by way of saying, okay, it takes a unanimous vote to declare something unconstitutional, then the problem, the immediate problem with that is that would lock into place a lot of previous Supreme Court decisions that you might not like, Republican decisions, Dobbs and Heller and whatnot. But if you've got a large enough majority in Congress to do that, to regulate the court, you'll also have, Citizens United would be another one, you'll also have a large enough majority in the Congress to reverse some of those egregious Supreme Court decisions. But I can't think of a single time that the Supreme Court has struck down a law as unconstitutional that I think was genuinely unconstitutional. Can you?
Yeah, I'm not arguing that. I'm not a fan of the Supreme Court.
Yeah, I can't think of one. They use this constitutionality argument as an excuse to strike down laws that they just don't like, or that their donors don't like, or that the billionaires who take them on cruises don't like. I think we need to put a stop to it, is my point.
the Democrats hide behind institutional norms instead of doing what needs to be done.
I don't disagree with you at all, Mark. Mark, thank you for the call. Alvin in Greeley, Colorado. Hey, Alvin, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Tom. Good to talk to you. I wanted to talk about Biden running again and how reporters keep asking if he is too old. I keep reading all these articles. I have yet to read an article asking if Trump is too old to run again. He's only 3 years younger.
Right.
And
he's obese.
Reporters,
I mean, he's much. If you're concerned about somebody dying in office, Trump is much higher on that list than Biden, who's an athlete. I mean, he's out there bicycling and stuff.
Oh, yeah. Well, they also question Biden's mental state, but it was Trump's doctor who had him take a test for dementia.
Right.
Now, while we were all laughing because he was bragging how he passed it, like the SATs, no one thought to ask, wait a minute, why did his doctor have him take a test for dementia?
Right.
Because he suspected he had dementia.
Yeah.
You know, do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I absolutely do, and I think you're absolutely right. Thank you, Alvin.
Right,
good point. Donna in Covington, Louisiana. Donna, we just have a minute here before the end of the hour. You got a quick one?
Oh, real quick. Precedent set by Roe versus Wade I cannot believe that the Supreme Court is ignoring precedents. Also, I was enthralled with what you said about foreign countries who imitate our democracy and they handle it better than we do.
Yeah.
I have an idea. Just an idea. I'm a former debater, and I'm 91 years old. But I think, especially the Supreme Court, if I'm not for a majority, I'm not for all of them voting for something. But I think we should make 7 out of 9 should vote for overturned precedents. We have to.
That's a good idea too. Yeah, a super
maybe
majority.
7 out of 9. Just my idea. I thank you so much. The first time I've watched you, I really appreciate you so much. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Donna. I think a supermajority is a good idea. It could be 2/3, it could be 7/10, or 7 out of 9. I guess that's about as close to 2/3 as you're going to get. There's a lot of ways to do this, but what I'm trying to do is stop the court, or at least stop these 6 Republicans on the court from further gutting our voting rights laws, from further diminishing our rights by claiming that the Constitution, in their minds, their brilliant interpretation, they're channeling the founders, informs them of this. It's BS, and we need to put an end to it. We'll be back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
We say fight back!
In addition to bringing you the Thom Hartmann Program here on Free Speech TV and Video Media Online, we also have a whole set of ways you can interact with us and tools you can use to spread the word about the importance of democracy and the threats to it in our republic. First, there's your daily homework. Sue Nethercutt puts together a daily email newsletter that has a link to every story I discuss on the air, so you can find my sources and you can share them with your friends. It's free and you can sign up at thomhartmann.com. Second, I publish my daily take every day over at the hartmannreport.com website. That's also free if you want the daily 5 days a week rant in your inbox. No ads either. Third, we have the podcasts. There's the free 1-hour version of our daily show that's advertising supported. You can find that wherever you get your podcasts normally. And then there's also the podcast of the entire 3-hour show with no advertisements and that's available by subscription over at thomhartmann.com. So check them all out at thomhartmann.com and hartmannreport.com.
Our Thom Hartmann Book Club excerpt today, we're reading from Ed Morales' new book, Fantasy Island, Colonialism, Exploitation, and the Betrayal of Puerto Rico. This is from the first chapter. There was never any doubt that the United States wanted Puerto Rico for its own when it began a war with Spain near the turn of the 20th century. Cuba had been in the throes of independence war with Spain off and on since 1868, and the conflict that began in 1895 seemed ripe for the United States to capitalize on. The sinking of the USS Maine, an American naval ship destroyed by an explosion while moored just outside Havana, fueled American entry into the war. Although there are conflicting theories about the source of the explosion, including the likelihood it was caused by a spontaneous internal fire, William Randolph Hearst's newspaper chain blew up the incident into the perfect catalyst for the United States to enter the conflict. When Theodore Roosevelt entered the fray with his army of Rough Riders, the whole affair came as no surprise to anyone who'd been paying attention to the lust U.S. government leaders and military had long expressed to expand southward and westward. And although the idea of manifest destiny was at the forefront of the political discourse of this period, it's less often observed that the United States' expansionist gaze was saturated with racial language and attitudes, at once desirous of and repelled by Latin America's mestizo mulatto social dynamic. The Haitian Revolution at the end of the 19th century and into the 20th created a U.S. obsession with both Cuba and Puerto Rico because of the potential of a similar black-led revolt on those islands. In 1826, Virginia Senator John Randolph feared that such a revolt would render the southern United States vulnerable to invasion from Cubans in rowboats. For this reason, he objected to the United States participating in the 1826 Panama Congress because American diplomats would have to endure the horror of a U.S. diplomat taking his seat in the Congress, quote, beside the native African, their American descendants, the mixed breeds, the Indians, and the half-breeds, without any offense or scandal at so motley a mixture, end quote. The logic driving this perspective underlined not only the importance of slavery to the emergence of capitalism in the 19th century, but also, as Matthew Karp points out in this vast southern empire, the extent to which slave owners and their elected representatives disproportionately shaped U.S. foreign policy. Going back as far as the Haitian Revolution, fear of a successful slave rebellion in the newly formed United States strongly motivated Southern politicians. As Karp mentions, to that end, Presidents Madison and Monroe, quote, used overwhelming force to destroy black maroon settlements in southern Florida, end quote. Fear of slave rebellions also briefly united the interests of American slaveholders and Cuban elites who wanted independence from Spain, but in the late 19th century, after abolition, Roosevelt's forces fought in conjunction with Afro-Cuban armies against their common Spanish foe. The move to wrest Cuba and Puerto Rico from Spain came just as Spain had finally relented to end slavery as a concession to black rebel Cuban armies that had formed to push for independence. In a further move to placate continued unrest on the island, in November 1897, Spain signed automatic charters for Cuba and Puerto Rico, which gave limited home rule governments to both islands. Puerto Rico would gain full representation in the Cortes, the Spanish parliament, and could veto Spanish commercial treaties unfavorable to them while also retaining the rights to set tariffs on imports and exports. In this way, Puerto Ricans were granted a kind of citizenship that allowed self-government grafted on what was left of their Spanish subjecthood. Yet on July 25, 1898, 8 days after the first meeting of the newly formed Puerto Rican Parliament, U.S. troops arrived in the southern port of Guanica and replaced the Spanish flag with the stars and stripes. This date would be remembered over 50 years later when the United States finally followed through on a project to allow Puerto Ricans to have limited autonomy and self-government. But at the time, it was both the end of Teddy Roosevelt's splendid little war and the beginning of the current quandary over what exactly Puerto Rico's new colonial master would do with the island. Although historians agree that there was no pre-existing plan for designating Puerto Rico's status, there was a general belief that Puerto Rico could be incorporated as a U.S. territory and probably would be. This led many to assume that it would follow a similar path to statehood as former territories like Florida and Louisiana. At the very least, it would, by acceding to military control, receive, quote, the advantages and blessings of enlightened civilization, end quote, as Puerto Rico's first military governor, Nelson A. Miles, declared 3 days after the landing of Guanica. Because Cuba was so militarized during its wars for independence, the United States decided to allow it national sovereignty, thinking it could still exert considerable control over the economy because of existing business interests and a ready-made set of Cuban consumers who were already buying Ford Model Ts. But although Puerto Rico had experienced anti-Spanish uprisings in the mid-19th century, in 1898 they did not have nearly the same level of armed mobilization present. So the United States held on to it, particularly because of its geographic location, which would provide the United States with a stronghold on the easternmost tip of the Caribbean. The book is Fantasy Island by Ed Morales.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back to the second hour of our program. On the line with us is the consumer advocate, lawyer, author, former presidential candidate, host of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, publisher of the new newspaper Capitol Hill Citizen, and the author of the foreword to my book on the hidden history of American monopolies, Ralph Nader. CapitolHillCitizen.com, by the way, the website. Ralph Nader on Twitter. Ralph, welcome back to the program. It's been a while.
Thank you very much, Tom. Thank you for that history lesson, too.
Yeah, that book was fun to write, and I really appreciated your intro for it, your foreword. So tell me about Capitol Hill Citizen, this new newspaper that you're launching.
Well, it's 42 pages when it comes out, and as you say, it can be obtained by going to CapitolHillCitizen.com. It's only $5, and half of it is the first-class mail, so it's a very good deal. It's in print only, and we're getting a tremendous response because a normal mainstream covering of Capitol Hill is called official source journalism. They'll cover what the senators and representatives choose to say or do publicly, but Capitol Citizen digs in all kinds of great stories. For example, from somebody in New York, we got a lead that the Congress committees don't produce transcripts anymore on time, and they don't even print the hearings they used to send to all the depository libraries. So if the press doesn't cover them, like they don't cover a lot of congressional hearings, people don't know what's going on in Congress. There's a lead article on the Justice Department's sweetheart deal with Boeing, whose planes killed 346 people in Indonesia and Ethiopia. We should not forget.
The MAX 9.
And they cut a deal there. But just to give you an example, Tom, there was a hearing by a former head of CDC, Dr. Robert Redfield, that wasn't covered almost at all. He asked for a moratorium on gain of function research. Well, gain of function is a fancy word to describe scientists who try to make viruses more virulent and more dangerous in order, supposedly, to understand them better. And that's what the suspicion at the Wuhan Institute with the COVID, which is still, creating controversy on both sides. And he called for a moratorium, and that was ignored. I had it done. Well, apparently his leadership didn't want that letter sent, but it's published verbatim in the Capitol Hill Citizen. There's also an article where the Federal Reserve can't investigate itself. An independent inspector general is needed. There's a profile of Senator Jack Reed, the Democrat, who makes sure that every year the Senate gives more money than the generals asked for. And last year, look at this figure. he led the fight to add $48 billion with a B dollars to the gigantic military budget, beyond what the generals and Biden asked for. $48 billion is more than the federal budget of all the federal health, safety, and economic protection regulatory agencies. That's EPA, OSHA, Workplace Safety, Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, FDA, on and on. So all this stuff is being put in. But did you know, for example, that there was a demonstration in Washington recently on a weekend? There was over 1,000 people. They were conservative liberals fighting against the war machine, opposing it, peacefully, of course. And they would quote General Smedley Butler on their T-shirts, "War is a racket." And there are over 2 pages with colorful photos of each one of these 15 of them were chosen out of the 1,000 by the reporter, and they have the sign and they interview them. These people were given voice. They weren't given a single article in the mainstream press when they came to Washington.
Yeah, I think some of the concern
of all
around
stripes,
some of the concern
calling for an end to empire, the death and destruction overseas. It's boomeranging against our own security, of course, and public budgets that are blowing up things overseas instead of rebuilding the public infrastructure and providing adequate jobs in communities all over the country, drinking water safety, public transit improvement, bridges, highways, the same old list that's so often ignored. People can get it again just for $5. You can get the issue sent to you right away, first-class mail.
Yeah, CapitolHillCitizen.com is the website. Tell me also about the Incommunicados. You've got this website, incommunicadowatch.org. Bruce Fine is apparently your partner in this, and Bruce has been on this program a few times. It's been quite a few years since he's been on. He was just a little more Republican than I was comfortable with, but he's kind of a hardcore constitutionalist. Tell me about this, or is this a book? I'm looking at the website, communicadoswatch.org, Center for Study of Representative Law. Tell me about it.
Yeah, it's a book over 150 pages, full of letters that were never responded to by members of Congress, by attorney generals, members of the executive branch, and also around the country. We have a big problem here. Your listeners are going to resonate to this. How many times have we all heard people say, I sent a letter, a serious letter, not a case study, didn't get my VA check type letter, casework. We're not talking about letters or communications from donors, friends of members of Congress, or casework. They do respond to those. We're talking about serious proposals. Why aren't you having a congressional hearing on this? Why don't you make single payer a priority? Why don't you go after our porous tax system that's privileged for the rich and the big corporations? How about producing information about what you can do for the country that you're not doing? Anyway, a lot of serious proposals. And the same answer we didn't hear. The senator didn't respond to.
Right.
The representative didn't respond. The head of the SEC or the Federal Communications Commission didn't respond. And this occurred with us. We sent all kinds of letters. Bruce Fine is now a very progressive constitutional law expert, and he signed it with me and sometimes other people, and wouldn't even acknowledge it, Tom.
Yeah.
So we wouldn't even know that they actually got it, even though we sent it in all kinds of ways, emails, postal, sometimes faxes to members of Congress. Now, when I have written in the past to the Prime Minister of Canada, no matter who's Prime Minister, they send on official stationery a respectful acknowledgement. They say, we've received your letter, and we will refer it to the appropriate ministry. And the White House doesn't respond. The State Department doesn't respond. In fact, I wrote hundreds of letters to George W. Bush and Barack Obama, and only one was responded to by Michelle Obama.
Interesting.
The others didn't even acknowledge it. I put it in a book called Return to Sender.
Yeah.
So this incommunicados is an attempt to give you, the people, an opportunity to say, look, we know about the First Amendment. It's not only freedom of speech, the right to petition your government for redress of grievances.
You're right.
And if the government blots you out and doesn't acknowledge, doesn't respond, they're taking away that part of the First Amendment.
Ralph.
And I don't care if it's liberal or conservative, all people have told us, doesn't matter what their background, we don't get any response. So I say, well, what do you do? So I'm not writing them anymore. It's useless. So you call up members of Congress. If you ever can get a staff, you say, you people are not responding to serious proposals and questions and suggestions and urgings, etc., about the necessities of the American people. You're the main branch of Congress. And they say, well, we don't hear all that much from them anymore. Well, of course, if year after year you don't even bother using the franking privilege to send them a letter of acknowledgement or a decent response, then why should they continue this futility?
It costs them nothing. It costs them absolutely nothing. Ralph, we have just 1 minute here before we're going to hit a hard break that I can't control. It seems to me that an awful lot of this comes United and Buckley and these decisions that basically where the Supreme Court legalized bribery. You're sending letters, but you're not attaching a $10,000 check. What do you think? What's the solution?
Of course, you get through. They have information. If you call a member of Congress, some of them will take your name, and while they're talking to you, the receptionist, they can find out if you're a donor. If you're a donor of size, you get to speak to the representative and senator. If you're not a donor, you're lucky to get an intern.
And what can we do about this?
That's what this Incommunicado book, it gives you the constitutional arguments to say that your constitutional right to petition your government is being stifled. It gives all kinds of examples. We have dozens of letters here to Democrats, Republicans, William Barr, Merrick Garland, attorney generals under Republican and Democrat regimes. We even have letters to the New York Yankees on Yankee injuries, serious letters, or on excessive advertising, in-play ads, which never used to be the case when I was growing up and listening to Mel Allen. They don't respond. The bar associations don't respond when you say, why aren't you standing up to government illegality? You're supposed to be the sentinels for rule of law. Our own deans at Harvard Law School don't respond.
Ralph,
it's a cultural blackout by the rich.
Is the Thom Hartmann Program.
I get it. We're out of time. The website's CapitolHillCitizen.com and IncommunicatoWatch.org. Incommunicatoswatch.org. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, Tom.
Great talking with you. In Rochester, New York. Hey, Corky, what's on your mind today?
Well, I'm still working on the guns.
Okay.
I got a question. Now, we know the white supremacists are involved in politics heavily.
Mm-hmm.
And they're forcing white women to have babies because I believe they're worried about 2050 when the majority minority will take over. I'm wondering how difficult it is for a woman of color to get an abortion. That's my question.
Well, the consequence of systemic racism is that people of color generally have less wealth or income or both compared to white people. And, if you're going, particularly if you live in a red state where abortion has been outlawed, if you want to get an abortion, you're going to have to get on a plane or take a long drive to get someplace. And now, particularly if you live in the Deep South, you've got to go a long, long way. I mean, if this decision by the Fifth Circuit Court stands, if the Supreme Court lets this thing stand, that you have to see the doctor 3 different times on 3 different days before you can get an abortion, it will become very expensive to get an abortion. So, yeah, it becomes an economic issue as much as anything else, Corky.
Yeah, but I'm wondering if a woman of color, it's much easier. They'll tell her where to go to get the abortion. The white women, they're forcing them to have the babies because they're worried about the 2050.
Yeah,
Now,
I think weirdly there is a large racial component to the opposition to abortion within the white supremacist community. They don't want white women having abortions, period. I mean, that's well established and been out there for a long time. Somebody called, a week or so ago and said, the irony of that is that you're more likely to prevent black women from having abortions than white women, because white women, even if you outlawed abortion in the United States, white women are more affluent, generally speaking, than black women, and they're more likely to get on a plane and go to Canada. But I don't think the irony or the reality of that, I don't think they care. There are some people who are just, totally into this because of their religion, either their Catholicism or their fundamentalist Protestant evangelicism, and they're not going to change their minds. And the people.
They've got 27 years to work on it.
I know.
It's just beginning now, but they got 27 years to work on it.
What do you mean?
Where are the politicians going to take their mistresses?
Oh, hey, Texas is already majority minority. That's why they're aggressively gerrymandering the state. It's why they're passing all these laws, making it harder to vote. It's why they're going to follow what Ron DeSantis is doing and create an election police force. I mean, Texas is now less than half white, but the entire power structure of the state is white, or the majority of the power structure of the state is white, and they're doing everything they can.
You think they would not prosecute a doctor if he gave those pills to a woman of color? They're going to leave them alone.
I don't think that's true. I think they're going to prosecute anybody. I think this has gone to the point of just being ideologically inflexible. Corky, thank you for the call. It's bizarre that we're even having this conversation, frankly, and a sad commentary on where America's at right now. We'll be back. It's 22 minutes past the hour. Missed my opening rant today? It's usually published over at HartmannReport.com, where you can read it and share it with your friends for free. Check it out, HartmannReport.com. So now the autopsy has come out. Manuel Esteban Paez Terán, who is known by his friends as Tortuguita, is a young man who was a climate activist. He's actually originally from Venezuela, but he was down in Georgia along with a lot of other people protesting what is called Cop City, where they're ripping up a whole bunch of forest down there to build a phony urban environment where police can practice urban warfare or something like that. And there's been a lot of protests against this. And the police claimed that he had shot a cop, and therefore they shot him. 57 times, in fact, shot him dead. Now the autopsy has come out. It turns out he was sitting on the forest floor, cross-legged, with his hands in the air at the time he was shot. The police are still lying about this. There's a whole video about it over at tom.tv. Check it out. 24 minutes past the hour, how Republicans are silencing their constituents. This is a fascinating story. Red state, across red states. I mentioned this briefly yesterday. New York Times is reporting that in states like Ohio, you've got average citizens who are trying to get things on the ballot. Citizen initiatives, ballot initiatives, to protect a woman's right to choose to have an abortion, to guarantee people the right to smoke pot if they choose to, things like that. And Republicans in the Ohio legislature now are trying to pass their own ballot initiative that would only require a 50% vote to be put into law, that would say that all future ballot initiatives require a 60% vote. And to increase the probability that this will get voted on favorably, they are trying to set it up for a special election in August, because one of the things they know is that pretty much the only people who vote in special elections are old people, and most of the old people are Republicans. They're honestly trying to do this. In Kentucky, abortion rights were saved by a ballot initiative that was supported by the people on a 52 to 48% margin. 52 to 48? Well, you know, if it takes 60%, that right to abortion would not have been protected in Kentucky. In Kansas, 18-point margin of victory in favor of abortion rights. That was 59 to 41 to save abortion rights in Kansas. You can see why Republicans are trying to do this. In Missouri, they're pushing through the legislature a bill that would raise the constitutional amendment requirement to 60%. I mean, even conservatives, generally speaking, don't want their rights taken away, and yet that's what Republicans are doing. There are 23 states right now that can amend the constitutions through ballot initiatives, and the Republican Party is working to crush every single one of them. By the way, last night, Fani Willis, the prosecutor in the district attorney, prosecuting attorney in Fulton County, Georgia, Atlanta, more or less, notified the local sheriff, Sheriff Patrick Labatt, that she plans to announce possible indictments of Donald Trump starting as early as July 11th, which is about 6 weeks from now, right? If I'm doing my calendar in my head right, maybe 7 weeks, and or as late as September 1st. That's the next grand jury session, essentially. And she says, I'm providing this letter to bring to your attention the need for heightened security and preparedness in coming months due to this pending announcement. Back in May, when they first were having the grand jury meetings, they actually had snipers on rooftops. I mean, they're taking this stuff seriously.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
9 weeks. But in any case, there's that. Also, GOP snowflakes can't handle artwork. Say what? I'll tell you about that, and we'll pick up your calls on the other side of the break. Club today, our book is by Frantz Fanon, and it's The Wretched of the Earth. This is from the chapter on national culture on page 145. It sort of reads like Thomas Paine, actually. Each generation must discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it in relative opacity. In the underdeveloped countries, preceding generations have simultaneously resisted the insidious agenda of colonialism and paved the way for the emergence of the current struggles. Now that we are in the heat of combat, we must shed the habit of decrying the efforts of our forefathers or feigning incomprehension at their silence or passiveness. They fought as best they could with the weapons they possessed at the time, and if their struggle did not reverberate throughout the international arena, the reason should be attributed not so much to a lack of heroism, but to a fundamentally different international situation. More than one colonized subject had to say, "We've had enough." More than one tribe had to rebel. More than one peasant revolt had to be quelled. More than one demonstration had to be repressed for us to stand firm, certain of our victory. For those of us who are determined to break the back of colonialism, our historic mission is to authorize every revolt, every desperate act, and every attack aborted or drowned in blood. In this chapter, we'll analyze the fundamental issue of the legitimate claim to a nation. The political party that mobilizes the people, however, is little concerned with this issue of legitimacy. Political parties are concerned solely with daily reality, and it is in the name of this reality, in the name of this immediacy which influences the present and future of men and women, that they make their call to action. The political party may very well speak of the nation in emotional terms, but it is primarily interested in getting the people who are listening to understand that they must join in the struggle if they quite simply want to exist. We now know that in the first phase of the national struggle, colonialism attempts to diffuse nationalist demands by manipulating economic doctrine. At the first sign of a dispute, colonialism feigns comprehension by acknowledging with ostentatious humility that the territory is suffering from serious underdevelopment that requires major social and economic reforms. And it is true that certain spectacular measures, such as the opening of work sites for the unemployed here and there, delay the formation of a national consciousness by a few years. But sooner or later, colonialism realizes it is incapable of achieving a program of socioeconomic reforms
that would satisfy the aspirations of the colonized masses. Even when it comes to filling their bellies, colonialism proves to be inherently powerless. The colonial state very quickly discovers that any attempt to disarm the national parties at a purely economic level would be tantamount to practicing in the colonies what it did not want to do in its own territory. And it is no coincidence that today the doctrine of Cartierism is on the rise just about everywhere. Cartier's bitter disillusionment with France's stubborn determination to retain ties with people it will have to feed, whereas so many French citizens are in dire straits, reflects colonialism's inability to transform itself into a nonpartisan aid program. Hence, once again, no need to waste time repeating, better to go hungry with dignity than to eat one's fill in slavery. On the contrary, we must persuade ourselves that colonialism is procuring for colonized people, the material conditions likely to make them forget their quest for dignity. Once colonialism is understood where its social reform tactics would lead it, back come the old reflexes of adding police reinforcements, dispatching troops, and establishing a regime of terror better suited to its interests and its psychology. Within the political parties, or rather parallel to them, we find the cultured class of colonized intellectuals. The recognition of a national culture and its right to exist represent their favorite stomping ground. Whereas the politicians integrate their action in the present, the intellectuals place themselves in the context of history. Faced with the colonized intellectuals' debunking of the colonist theory of a pre-colonial barbarism, colonialism's response is mute. It is especially mute since the ideas put forward by the young colonized intelligentsia are widely accepted by metropolitan specialists. It is in fact now commonly recognized that for several decades, numerous European researchers have widely rehabilitated African, Mexican, and Peruvian civilizations. Some have been surprised by the passion invested by the colonized intellectuals in their defense of a national culture. But those who consider this passion exaggerated are strangely apt to forget that their psyches and their egos are conveniently safeguarded by the French or German culture, whose worth has been proven and which has gone unchallenged. I concede the fact that the actual existence of an Aztec civilization has done little to change the diet of today's Mexican peasant. I concede that whatever proof there is of the once mighty Songhai civilization does not change the fact that the Songhais today are undernourished, illiterate, abandoned to the skies and water, with a blank mind and glazed eyes. But as we have said on several occasions, this passionate quest for a national culture prior to the colonial era can be justified by the colonized intellectuals' shared interest in stepping back and taking a hard look at the Western culture in which they risk becoming ensnared. Fully aware that they're in the process of losing themselves and consequently of being lost to their people, these men work away with raging heart and furious mind to renew contact with their people's oldest inner essence, the furthest removed from colonial times. Let us delve deeper. Perhaps this passion and this rage are nurtured, or at least guided, by the secret hope of discovering beyond the pleasant wretchedness, beyond the self-hatred, something that redeems us.
We have a brand new site with everything you need to know about the Thom Hartmann Program over at thom.tv. That's THOM.tv. Check it out. So after the horrific school shooting in Tennessee, leaving 3 9-year-olds dead, as well as three adults, the Tennessee legislature has taken 2 very interesting steps. The first is they're moving to shield gun manufacturers and sellers from liability lawsuits. But even more interesting, the legislature has just passed a bill that sets up a statewide system where you can turn in teachers for teaching things that make children feel bad about themselves, specifically teaching white children that white people once enslaved black people. Seriously. Or teaching that, about the Holocaust, for example, that, white people in Germany killed Jews. This is apparently going to be not just outlawed in Tennessee, but there's a whole apparatus being set up right now so that you can turn in your neighbors. It's just incredible. There's a whole about it over at thom.tv, THOM.tv. Check it out.
Welcome back. 35 minutes past the hour. This is an interesting story. I'm not quite sure what to make of it, and maybe those of you listening in Minnesota can give me some insights. There's a one of its kind piece of art in the Wisconsin Center District, in the building where I guess it's the Civic Center. It's the building where the Republican National Convention is going to be held. It's a publicly funded convention center in Milwaukee, and this piece of art, it was created by Jill Sebastian back when the building was built in 1998. So it's 25 years old. It's called Portals and Writings Celebrating Wisconsin Authors, and it features the work of 48 Wisconsinite authors, and includes works by indigenous and diverse writers. And the Bulwark, which is mostly Republican writers, wrote an article titled "Tearing Down Art to Spare Republican Snowflake Feelings." Apparently, because some of these authors are black or Hispanic or Native American, they're afraid that this will offend the Republicans. One of the authors, Martha Berglund, said, "Since these words have been on the walls, thousands of visitors have been reading them, stepping out of the busyness of the moment." And she goes on to say, "Make no mistake, they are coming for us with their sandblasting systems, censorship of school curriculum, banned books. It would not be hard to see this action in Wisconsin as part of these larger efforts." Oh, did I say Minnesota? Excuse me, I meant Wisconsin. So, what's going on here? The art created by, I mentioned that. So I just don't know. If they're blowing up a piece of culturally significant artwork just to spare the feelings of Republican snowflakes, that's pretty pathetic. Anyhow, picking up your calls here, Anthony in Linden, Washington. Hey, Anthony, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom. I am actually the president of my condo association, and here in the state of Washington, the law is that it takes a 67% supermajority of the condo owners to amend our declarations and bylaws. So
that's not unusual. By the way.
I think that if it takes for something as simple as that, a condo association, to amend our bylaws, it takes a supermajority. So you would think that your idea of it requiring, I don't know about 100%, but at least a 67%, 70% of the Supreme Court justices to agree to uphold something as constitutional.
Right.
But my
right now they have 6 out of 9 votes, which is your supermajority. That is your 2/3.
So my question for you is, okay, so say, one day miraculously we get a majority in the Senate and in the Congress, and we're able to pass these, laws that you're proposing. So what happens to the previous rulings by the Supreme Court, like Dobbs, where it was decided in a lopsided, majority?
Right. The point, and I make this point in the article, is that if you had a strong enough congressional majority to alter the rules under which the Supreme Court operates, you're probably going to have a strong enough congressional majority to overturn some of the most egregious Supreme Court decisions. And I'm thinking Dobbs, I'm thinking Citizens United, I'm thinking Shelby County, that gutted the Voting Rights Act. These can all be overturned. They don't even require constitutional amendments. They can all be overturned by simple law. Citizens United would be a little harder, or a law would be a little less comprehensive than a constitutional amendment. But constitutional amendments are a huge lift. That's my thinking on that, Anthony, if that makes sense.
All right. Thank you. Thank you so much, Tom.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for the call. George in Chicago. Hey, George, what's on your mind today?
Well, Tucker Carlson's on my mind, Tom. Since he got fired, I've been looking up stuff about him, and some of these fun facts are really fun. I found out that his biological parents got divorced in 1976 when he was about 7 years old. And in 1979, his father married Patricia Caroline Swanson, who was the Swanson heiress.
Right.
So she is his stepmother, not his biological mother. His biological mother moved to France after the divorce, and the father got custody of Tucker and his brother. In any event, I have no knowledge, of course, of the internal financial dynamics of the family, so I don't know if his stepmother has provided for him in her will or not. I did find that it appears his net worth is around $30 million, which is pretty darn good for most of us. But
that seems low, given that he was being paid $35 million a year.
Well, you know, these things are kind of hard to tease out.
Yeah.
But
and of course, I'm only on the $35 million. I'm only going by press reports. I mean, they may not be true either. Rush Limbaugh was claiming he was making $400 million. And he was inflating the numbers hugely.
Yeah, I did see sources that cited his salary as lower than $35 million. But what's also interesting about him is that growing up as I did on the south side of Chicago, me and people from my neighborhood would recognize him immediately as a snotty punk, which is what he is. He was enrolled as an adolescent in an exclusive boarding school in Switzerland, but got kicked out. And when he graduated from Trinity College in 1991, the yearbook described him as a member of the, quote, Dan White Society, unquote, a reference to the assassin who murdered George Moscone and Harvey Milk.
Right.
That says a lot about who and what he is and always has been.
Yeah.
He applied to the CIA after graduation, and his application was rejected. His father then told him, pursue a career in journalism because they'll take anybody.
Well, his father was the head of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, wasn't he?
That's right, he was.
Yeah.
And he was also with the Voice of America before that, and then after Corporation for Public Broadcasting, he was an ambassador to the Seychelles.
Yeah.
But I also found something that you as a psychological counsel would be interesting in. He is left-handed and dyslexic, which explains, I think, or at least it gives an insight into some of his behavior and his personality.
The source of some of his rage, you mean?
Yeah. He's also a former smoker. He had started in 8th grade. And to this day, since he quit, he constantly chews nicotine gum and wears nicotine patches. And believe it or not, he is a Deadhead, fan of the Grateful Dead, who has attended over 50 Dead concerts.
Well, that's like one little positive note about him. I didn't realize he was a nicotine addict, but that's, you can't knock people for being, drug addicts if they're not, inflicting their drugs on other people. At least he's not blowing smoke in other people's faces anymore.
Here's the one last thing that says a lot about how he's essentially a dictatorial, tyrannical personality and who he worships, like the president of Hungary. He spoke at the funeral of longtime Hells Angels president Sonny Barger. Carlson was a fan of his since his college years, loved the Barger quote of stay loyal, remain free, and always value honor. And he said that's the kind of man he wanted to pay tribute to. This is a guy who was essentially an organized crime.
Right. He was running meth and guns, wasn't he, Barger?
Oh, and any other kind of substance that would make money for the boys.
Yeah.
And this is who he worships. But still, he's a punk who grew up in a wealthy family, went to exclusive schools, so he's just a wannabe.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think an awful lot of that also describes Donald Trump, who made it all the way into the White House. So I am not discounting this guy, and I'm concerned. George, thank you. Thank you for the call, and thanks for the research. That's fascinating. It's 15 minutes before the hour. We'll be right back with more of your calls in just a moment here on the Thom Hartmann Program.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
Defending America from the weapons of mass deception. Back with your calls. And welcome back. Nicholas in San Cristobal, Mexico. Hey, Nicholas, what's on your mind today?
Tucker Carlson, and vis-a-vis what you just said to the last caller, like you, I am not discounting Tucker Carlson in any way, although a lot of people seem to think he's a wannabe and a has-been and he's a nothing burger. I absolutely disagree, and this is why. A couple of things I want to toss out very quickly, I hope. The New York Times has an interesting article today, not entirely about Trump and Carlson, but it does come up. And they are quoting an anonymous source that they have vetted and says is true, as being someone very close to Donald Trump, who says that Tucker Carlson and Donald Trump over the past 6 weeks have become closer than they have ever been, despite Carlson's texts and emails disparaging Trump. That all has been forgiven, and they have been on the phone apparently a lot over the last several weeks only.
Yeah.
That's
interesting. Can you spell Vice President Carlson?
Well, you're beating me to the punch here. Add to that my belief in Sun Tzu's The Art of War always. And his advice was what? Keep your friends close and your enemies closer. So what could be better than a tag team match against Biden of Trump and Tucker Carlson? Right. It would serve both their purposes. And here's the awful part about a tag team. At the end of Trump's second term, anything that he has not accomplished to bring the country down, Tucker Carlson will receive the baton and finish the job off and deliver the final coup de grace against we the people.
Right, and he'd not even be 60 years old.
Exactly. And a quick personal question. Did Sean ever get the video to you about the Roland keyboard? I hope.
Yeah. Thank you for that.
Yay. Did you listen to it?
I did. I'm still negotiating with Louise about whether
just tell Louise to behave herself here, because I can already hear you playing a complete symphony with just your right hand, and I'm getting myself one because I'm prepared to write some songs that have been desperately trying to get out of me since mice ate and destroyed my piano 2-3 years ago. And so I'm getting back to my music, and I encourage you to get on to your music, Mr. Hartmann.
Yeah, okay. All righty. Thank you, Nicholas. Thank you. Right. Thanks for the referral. Good talking to you. I appreciate it. Paul in Ambler, Pennsylvania. Hey, Paul, what's on your mind today?
Oh, hi, Tom. I'm thinking about the announcement by President Biden for his reelection bid. And one of the things that I believe that he needs to really lead with, as well as, all good Democrats across the country and your listeners, write letters to the editor and all that, is community college. Going back to President Obama, he came up with a plan at the same time he was nationalizing the national student loans. People really forget what he did back then. He was starting to get control over the financial mechanism that allowed people to further their education beyond high school, which he says is something that we need in the 21st century. Mm-hmm. And I can certainly say by the year 2000, if you didn't have at least a 2-year degree with something useful like IT, computer repair, carpentry, cosmetology, going to a 4-year college to become an English major was a waste of time. Obama, then Biden, and then certainly Biden's wife have been promoting free community college as part of the base.
Which is a good thing. Thank you. Hey, thanks so much for sharing our program and for reaching out to our stations and sponsors and letting them know that you're listening. It really means a lot to us. So back in the 1980s, Louise and I lived in Germany for a year, and one of the stories that I remember hearing from some of the older people who were there in Stadtsteinach, who had been alive during the Hitler era, was that the radio and television stations, well, they didn't have television stations, but the radio stations and the newspapers back then had, on radio, it was a particular time of the day, and in newspapers, a particular part of the paper, where people could write in or people could call in and denounce their neighbors for being gay or for being disloyal or for being secretly Jewish. And that would then cause the neighbors to all go after them because it was a matter of public record. Now, anything states do in the United States is a matter of public record. The Attorney General of Missouri, Andrew Bailey, has just put up a form on the government's website, the Transgender Center Concerns form, where you can report your neighbors for dressing up as women. This is nuts. Check it out. There's a whole piece about it at tom.tv. 9 minutes before the hour, picking up your calls. Brian in Albuquerque, listening on KTRC. Hey, Brian, what's on your mind today?
Hey, good morning. Just called in to speculate on Tucker and the future of the Republican Party. I think there's going to be a huge fight within it with all the different players. And just to speculate, I don't think DeSantis is going to get in. I think everybody realizes that Trump is a sick, psychopathic puppy, and he wants the presidency more than anything, and he'll destroy anybody that gets in his way. Oh. So DeSantis is going to bow out. Everybody else, I mean, Haley and Asa will stay in. But Trump's going to destroy the Republican Party. I think it's inevitable. Yeah. And unless he has a major health issue, you know, if he has a stroke or something, then it's a whole new ball game. It'll be unbelievable how much things will change. Anyway,
I agree with
you,
Brian.
Tucker.
I think DeSantis is going down in flames because his personality is just so unlikable. I mean, at least Tucker can come across as likable, and so can Trump. I mean, you know, charming sociopaths is a thing because it's it's one of the more common characteristics of sociopaths is charm.
It's one of their main assets.
Yeah,
is charming people. But I think the big fights in the next 2 to 4 years are going to be Congress and the Senate.
Yeah.
And I think Tucker's going to get involved in that. And then once the post-Trump era begins, then we're going to see a lot of tough infighting within Republicans. And in Congress in general is filled with old people. In 5 to 10 years, there's going to be a lot of new players in big positions in Congress, and things are really going to kind of break loose. Right. And I just think that this whole Tucker thing, I think we should use it as a way to examine popular media in the United States in general, which of course is television and YouTube. You know, and then let's use this coronation of Prince Charles to be King of England as an example. Let's watch how many hours our corporate media will spend fawning over the UK royals, some of the worst people in the world, instead of addressing serious issues that are going on within the United States. And that's all I got for you today.
Yeah, well, it was a good one, Brian. We'll see how it shakes out. You know, it's time will tell. But Patrick in East Lansing, Michigan. Hey, Patrick, what's on your mind today?
Oh, hi, Tom. I wondered if James Bopp and the Right to Life movement's strategy has come on your radar. We have a really good historian of the pro-life movement and how they basically helped to give us Citizens United and unlimited money in politics and also blew up the Republican Party. It's a story that I hadn't fully understood, even though I've been on the election law listserv with James Bopp since 2001 and read his emails week in, week out. But he gave all of his papers to Mary Ziegler, and he explained to her, after she wrote 2 amazing books on abortion law and politics, how the pro-life movement could not trust the Republican Party, was not getting what they needed, and had to develop a different strategy. So they tried to get a constitutional amendment after Roe, didn't work. They couldn't reliably get the Republicans on board. Christine Todd Whitman went sideways on them. Reagan had been pro-choice, Nelson Rockefeller. They just could not abide the Republican
So they went for the courts.
they were not willing to take this strategy of being afraid of their own shadow and not criticizing their Republican leadership. And what they decided to do was to constitutionalize unlimited money and get rid of disclosure requirements so that outside groups would have outside influence. And they took on that strategy because it would give them the presidency and control of the Republican Party and control of the court. Boom,
Wait a minute, so
boom,
you're saying
boom.
Citizens United was initiated as an attempt to outlaw abortion?
What James Bopp decided was that if he did not get as fully involved in pushing for Citizens United and expanding Buckley and getting rid of disclosure limits and getting rid of limits on electioneering communications, all of which he succeeded in doing, by the way, then the pro-life movement could not succeed in overturning Roe, full stop. And he reached that conclusion and set about and you should have Mary Ziegler come on the show. She read everything he ever wrote. He turned over all of his papers. He opened up all the groups. He wanted this grassroots story to be told. And I'm reading her book, Dollars for Life. I think you should have her on the show. I draw these lessons from the book, okay? Number one, he understood structurally what had to be done, and he had a strategic plan to get it. Democrats do not. Okay, you've said on your show that you support all these different things, filibuster reform, rebalancing the court with 3 extra justices, as was done with Grant in 1869, for example. 5 times it's been done, limiting the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court, getting back the control of our democracy from the court, and National Popular Vote Plan. You've talked about all of those things, okay, and campaign finance reform through campaign initiatives for donor dollars to be taken out of your taxes.
You've got about 15 seconds here, Patrick, to make your final point.
So the last thing I would say is that as a grassroots movement, we're not willing to go after a party, the Democratic Party, that's not willing to adopt a strategic plan, which is the only way to get out of jail free.
You're kind of echoing Ralph Nader here, Patrick.
Well, I'm suggesting it's doable, and it's doable only if our friends get a little bit of heat.
Yeah, I'm with you. Thank you. Thank you very much. We'll be back. We're hitting the top of the hour here. Florida school districts are banning dozens of books based on proposed legislation. Stay tuned.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
In addition to bringing you the Thom Hartmann Program here on Free Speech TV and Video Media Online, we also have a whole set of ways you can interact with us and tools you can use to spread the word about the importance of democracy and the threats to it in our republic. First, there's your daily homework. Sue Nethercutt puts together a daily email newsletter that has a link to every story I discuss on the air, so you can find my sources and you can share them with your friends. It's free and you can sign up at thomhartmann.com. Second, take every day over at the hartmannreport.com website. That's also free if you want the daily 5 days a week rant in your inbox. No ads either. Third, we have the podcasts. There's the free 1-hour version of our daily show that's advertising supported. You can find that wherever you get your podcasts normally. And then there's also the podcast of the entire 3-hour show with no advertisements, and that's available by subscription over at thomhartmann.com. So check them all out at thomhartmann.com and hartmannreport.com.
Back at the Thom Hartmann Book Club. Today we're reading from Point to Point Navigation, a memoir by Gore Vidal. This is from the last 2 chapters, and we're reading from page 258. In 1961, a new president of the United States, John F. Kennedy, was inaugurated at the age of 43. With him, a new generation had taken the crown from the older generation as represented by General Eisenhower. There was triumphant talk of a new frontier, presumably to be crossed by all of us into a bright new land where the only shadow that marred the prospect was that of the hideous, murderous specter of international conflict upon the Soviet Union, against whom JFK had sworn to bear any burden to ensure the ultimate victory of freedom, liberty, and so on. But early on, starting in 1959, under the general direction of then Vice President Richard Nixon, who had many interesting Cuban mob connections, yes, Bibi Rebozo, his mysterious friend, was also linked not only to mobsters, but to the Cuban dictator Batista, who had been overthrown by Fidel Castro, to the annoyance of the mob, an annoyance that turned to fury when Castro shut down, if only briefly, the mafia-run Havana casinos. Elements of the CIA were soon attempting to murder Castro, who, like all Nixon enemies, was, if not yet a communist, worst a communist dupe. The presidential election of 1960 was a close one, fought by Nixon and John Kennedy, an attractive Massachusetts senator whose father had, ironically, dealings with many mobsters during the pre-World War II period, as well as at the time of the prohibition of alcohol. The late film producer Ray Stark told me how, during the short presidency of JFK, Joe Kennedy and Frank Costello, the retired New York mob overlord, would often have dinner at Kennedy's Central Park South apartment and rehash old crimes, often in the country of a retired teamster who gave great massages. Joe's mob connections were useful to Jack in the 1960 election and could easily have saved JFK's life in 1963 had Bobby Kennedy, in the interest of building himself up in the public eyes, not started arresting important mobsters, particularly in the so-called Appalachian Mob Conference, bust, where they had all come together to confer about the secession of the leadership of the New York mob. I've long since forgotten how I first heard of the plot to kill JFK, while I had no idea at all of the Kennedy brothers' plot to kill Castro on December 1st, 1963, until I read a recent book by Lamar Waldron and Thom Hartmann called Ultimate Sacrifice. It was assumed that the Cuban Missile Crisis of '62 had sufficiently alarmed JFK and Castro's mentor Khrushchev so that they jointly backed down, putting an end, so everyone thought, to such dangerous adventures. JFK had pledged not to invade Cuba if Castro would allow inspections of any remaining missiles on the island. Since Castro did not cooperate, JFK then regarded his pledge as inoperative. In the spring of 1963, according to Ultimate Sacrifice, more a literal than an ironic title, John and Robert Kennedy started laying the groundwork for a coup against Fidel Castro that would eventually be set for what they called C-Day, December 1st, 1963. Bobby, like Nixon before him, was in charge of what would be the most secretive operation of its sort in our history. Since the CIA had, in the eyes of the Kennedys, botched the 1961 Bay of Pigs invasion, the Department of Defense was to be in charge of this adventure, which would first engage mob hitmen to assassinate Castro and then replace Castro with a provisional government that would implore the United States to come to its aid and restore order. Ours is a society riddled with plots of every kind, from, let's say, one to bribe certain members of Congress to cheat Indians of their casino money, to the financing, often secretly, of numerous presidential elections, while simultaneously great companies like Enron cheat customers, stockholders, and employees. Yet everyone who draws attention to all of this corruption is quickly denounced as a conspiracy theorist who means to undo the great fiction that anything truly wicked, at least in the murder line, must be the work of a solitary lone nut who is simply evil. Hence the setting up of Lee Harvey Oswald as the lone crazed killer of JFK, despite his own brief but presumably accurate statement after his Dallas arrest, "I'm the patsy." Then, as planned, his being gunned down by Jack Ruby, a fellow CIA asset. Oswald as lone killer for no reason at all, and addled Ruby, a one-time Chicago mobster who claimed to be deeply worried about the stress all this must be causing the widow Kennedy. And he goes on in chapter 55. Ultimate Sacrifice describes how the Kennedy C-Day plan was penetrated by three mafia godfathers, Carlos Marcello, New Orleans, Santo Trafficante, Tampa, Florida, and Johnny Roselli out of Chicago. All three were being vigorously pursued by Attorney General Robert Kennedy, along with a dozen of their associates, of whom 6 were also working on the Castro murder case. The crime bosses then used parts of the C-Plan, a.k.a. AM World, to arrange JFK's assassination in a way that would prevent a thorough government investigation in order to protect the coup plan, its participants, as well as, naturally, national security by invoking the secrecy surrounding the C-Plan. The The mob bosses targeted JFK twice before Dallas, once in Chicago on November 2nd. JFK called off his motorcade. And then in Tampa on November 18th. He survived unscathed. Ultimate Sacrifice reveals and details why Robert Kennedy later told several close associates the name of the Godfather, Carlos Marcello, who had ordered his brother killed. But he couldn't do anything about it for fear the Soviets might go to war. Ironic and tragic action. I recalled when over the years I'd asked why what happened at Dallas happened. I'd answer, because Bobby had broken a truce made with the mob by Joe Kennedy in 1960. The book, Point-to-Point Navigation by Gore Vidal.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
So is Ron DeSantis going down in flames? Midas Touch is tweeting, places Ron DeSantis has visited since the historic flooding in Fort Lauderdale, Ohio, South Carolina, Utah. He's in Japan right now. Places Ron DeSantis has not visited since the historic flooding in Fort Lauderdale? Fort Lauderdale. And when he was in Japan, he was asked about, Trump and the polls and all this kind of stuff. And he answered with this bobblehead thing, which is now like totally gone viral. The video of him doing his bobblehead routine has been now seen by 17 million times. By the way, the state of Florida is paying for his trip to Japan, and from there he's going on to Israel and whatnot. It's like he's trying to burnish his foreign policy credentials is the bottom line. I mean, this is purely what it is. Meanwhile, down in Florida, a Florida school district has just banned The Handmaid's Tale. Let that sink in. 6-week abortion ban, and then they banned the book The Handmaid's Tale. The Handmaid's Tale, of course, is the dystopian novel about what happens when, when abortion is banned, basically, among other things. There's a bill working its way through the Florida legislature, HB 1069, and it seeks to ban pornography, right? So this is always the excuse. Oh, we're talking about pornography here. Well, what's pornography? Any mention of a gay person, that's pornographic. And it is so, in the Supreme Court case that defined obscenity, this was back in the 60s, the Miller case, they identified obscenity as sexual content that, and I'm quoting from the decision, taken as a whole appeals to the prurient interests and lacks serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. Pornography, sex for sex's sake. But under this new bill that Florida is advancing, that definition goes out the window, and basically pornography becomes just anything that Republicans in Florida decide it is. And based on this, there is a school district in Florida that is already banning books based on legislation that has not yet been signed, has not yet passed. This is Clay County Schools. In a spreadsheet published by the Clay County School District listing the status of challenge books, 55 titles were categorized as pending legislative update. And so, on it goes from there. But under this new definition, books like Catcher in the Rye, which, I remember reading when I was in high school. It was a very exciting book to read because it had so many instances of obscenity in it. The character, Holden Caulfield, if I'm remembering correctly, it's been 50 years, but, he was constantly using the GD word, the damn word and stuff like that. But it was a fairly tame book. It was a teenage angst book. I don't recall a sex scene in it.
The Odyssey, Homer, really? Illegal? The Story of a Girl has been banned. This was a finalist for the National Book Award. It's about a 13-year-old. In the book, the 13-year-old does have sex, but there's no description of it. There's no sex scene. It's just mentioned that, yeah, she had sex. But that's apparently enough. There's a book, Julian is a Mermaid, about a little boy who wants to be a mermaid. It doesn't mention gay anything. But hey, that's too close to trans for the good city fathers and county fathers and mothers of Florida, of Clay County, Florida. It turns out that there's behind all this so-called Challenge Oversight Committee is this guy Bruce Friedman, who is a conservative activist who moved to Clay County back in 2021 from New York. And he has compiled a list of over 3,600 books that he says have concerning content. He is the president and founder of the Florida chapter of the No Left Turn in Education group, which is a book banning group, apparently. It was founded in 2020 by Elena Yaron Fishbein. And she says there are evil forces focused on, quote, getting to our kids, brainwashing them, indoctrinating them, and making them brown shirts. And Friedman learned about her when she was on Tucker Carlson's show. Everything seems to kind of loop back around, right? When he was interviewed by, there's a whole story about this by Judd Legum over at popular.info, by the way. When Friedman was interviewed by Judd Legum about this, apparently an email, he admitted that he had filed challenges without reading any of these books. And he said he's not aware of any children who had such content negatively impact their lives. But he says that's irrelevant. He says, I don't have to know them. It's all of them. And now this Challenge Oversight Committee has permanently or indefinitely removed over 100 books at Friedman's request. But he's not satisfied. He's submitted an appeal for 159 books that he wanted banned that they haven't banned. He said that he plans to, quote, continue to reveal how much harm the American Library Association and their Marxist drones and you, speaking to Judd Legum of popular.info, have caused America's children. I'm not going away, Friedman added. There's no harmony to be had. There's no middle ground at all. Excuse me. I thought I could mute that fast enough, but I missed the button. So, here we are, banning books in Florida as the governor of Florida is bobbleheading around Japan. I don't think he's going to make it. There we go again. Now, meanwhile, the Republican Party wants to pack some courts. They're, totally hysterical about increasing the size of the Supreme Court. In fact, Ted Cruz has introduced legislation, a constitutional amendment to make it illegal to add members to the Supreme Court. Pardon me, sneezing again. But Texas has this bizarre, this is truly amazing. Right now, if you want to sue a business, in Texas, it is handled by the regular court system. And the regular court system, the principal place where places are appealed is in the state capital, Austin, which is kind of progressive, and you're very likely to get even a progressive judge. So Greg Abbott has this idea. He wants to create a new court just for his billionaire friends and their companies. A brand new court. It will have, all of its judges will be appointed by Greg Abbott himself, all 7 judges. He's going to call it the business court. All business disputes would be adjudicated there. So if you want to sue a company in Texas, you have to go to this court. And there will be an appeals court that goes along with it, the 15th Circuit Appeals Court, state appeals court, which will also be entirely stacked by Greg Abbott.
So basically, business companies in Texas are going to get a super, super, super free ride if this thing passes. And because these will be statewide, the business appeals court judges, excuse me, I said that they would be appointed. They will be elected, but they will be elected on a statewide basis. And, there hasn't been a Democrat elected statewide in Texas in 30 years. So, or not more than, one or two. So now the Republican Party wants to pack the courts. Brilliant. What do we do about this? Well, I don't know. How long is it going to take before Texans wake up to what's going on in their own state? This is not a healthy thing for children and living things. It's great for businesses. Billionaires will love it. And I'm sure they're pouring more and more money into Greg Abbott and, Dan Patrick's campaign coffers. Can French fries bring on depression? The weirdest geeky science right after this.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
And, of course, your calls. We'll be picking up your calls in just a moment. Stay tuned. And welcome back. Lawrence in Berkeley, California. Hey, Lawrence, what's on your mind today?
Yeah, hi, Tom. I wanted to explain how the Democrats can win the 24 election for sure.
Okay, I'm all ears.
But first, a little bit of statistics, since I can only call once a week. I have time to look things up. It says here, in the U.S., 18% of individual Americans make less than $100,000 a year. More than $100,000. So that's only 18% making over $100,000.
Right.
And that seems to me to be a very good reason why the Democrats have to concentrate on those 82% that are under 100,000 and talk about the economic advantages for them.
Yeah.
And we have to do this all the time. We have to talk about raising the minimum wage to probably $17 or $18 an hour. We have to talk about making it easier to join unions. We have to talk about eliminating this absurd non-competitive clause in your work sign up so that you can't, when you quit, you can't go for a better job in the same industry. We have to talk about the tax write-off for children. All of those things that will appeal to that 82% that are under $100,000. And we have to start doing it now because we have, if we deal with the economy, this is not to say that we don't talk about abortion and we don't talk about democracy. Of course, you have to talk about those. But you have to have a steady plan for the economic advantages for the very poor, the working class, and the middle class.
Yeah, remember Bill Clinton's 96 re-election campaign internal slogan, "It's the economy, stupid"?
Well, yes, but fix it for the poor.
Exactly.
That's not what Clinton did. No Democrat has done that.
Well, the
really,
problem is the poor don't vote in large enough numbers. This is a tragedy, but poor people are much less likely to vote than anybody else in the United States.
Well, if you start the campaign now and you start building organizations in the communities and in unions that will talk about voting and talk about all of the economic advantages that the Democrats will bring you, we'll start getting an FDR-type vote because we haven't had a solid for the poor Democrat since FDR, which is why...
Lyndon Johnson declared a war on poverty and put into place a huge spectrum. Lyndon Johnson put into place food stamps, Section 8 housing, housing supports. I can't even remember the whole list, but there was all of this stuff in the war on poverty, and what they learned was that it didn't cause poor people to come out and vote.
He ruined it with the war in Vietnam.
Yeah, of course.
So much money was spent. That's what happened, because that totally divided the left electorate.
But I agree with you, Lawrence. I think most people vote based on economics. That's the one thing that is always predictable. If a president is running for re-election during a recession, they lose. If they're running for re-election during good economic times, they win. That's why Jerome Powell is trying to throw us into a recession, because he's a lifelong Republican. Lawrence, I got to move along. Thank you for the call. Change starts with you. You can be calling your Democratic or Republican representatives to let them know what you think by calling 202-224-3121. It's the Capitol switchboard. It'll get you right through to them. Fort Lauderdale, Florida recently got whacked with 25 inches of rainfall in less than 7 hours. Tornadoes are tearing up the South and the Midwest in ways that they haven't seen, frankly, ever before. I mean, there have always been tornadoes, but not like these. 200-mile-an-hour winds, these derecos that are a mile long. We have a serious crisis going on right now. There's also a major El Nino. It's off the coast of Peru right now. It's affecting the West Coast. So we're seeing wild swings from drought to floods to drought to floods in the West Coast. Climate change is here. Climate change is real, and climate change is a crisis. What do we know about it? What do we know about these things? How much worse is it going to get before it might get better? What can we do about it? We had a long conversation with Dr. Michael Mann, Distinguished Professor and Director of the Center for Science, Sustainability, and the Media at the University of Pennsylvania. You can check it out at tom.tv. Alrighty, a quick geeky science for you, and then I'll pick up your phone calls here. French fries. Scientists warn that eating too many fried foods can make you depressed. Say what? They looked at 140,000 people in the United Kingdom who filled out a questionnaire on what they had eaten in the previous 24 hours and did this over a 4-day period. So they had a pretty good sense of what these people eat. And then they followed them for an average 11 years. This is a large, long-term, longitudinal study, 11 years, 140,000 people. And what they found was that people who had fried food, at least one portion of fried food every 4 days, were 12% more likely to have anxiety and 7% more likely to experience depression. Now, at first they were thinking, okay, is it that people who have anxiety and are depressed are craving fried foods? Are we, mixing up causation and correlation here? Turns out, no. There's actually a chemical that is formed when you fry foods. It's called acrylamide. And this chemical is formed when you fry starchy when you fry carbohydrates, when you superheat, when you take carbohydrates above the temperature at which they might burn. So when you fry potatoes, for example, French fries. And the other big one, the two that they found that were specifically tied to high levels of anxiety and depression were French fries, potato chips, 3 foods, but 2, potatoes, and fried white meat like fried chicken. And it's not the chicken, it's the breading on the chicken. And what happens is it forms acrylamide, and acrylamide produces inflammation of the brain, which is not good for you. The study highlights, quote, the significance of reducing fried food consumption for mental health. The authors note diet has recently been linked with the risk of developing depression and anxiety. A Western diet of fried or processed foods, refined grains, sugary products, and beer is associated with higher risk of depression and anxiety. Typically, fried foods are part of the Western diet. And then they thought, okay, well, let's once again, let's just try to take the people out of this. I mean, again, could it be placebo effect? Could it be that people who are depressed crave fried foods and the acrylamide is just an accident? So what they did is they exposed zebrafish to acrylamide to see how their behavior changes. These are, little tropical fish, right? And it turns out that the zebrafish showed behaviors similar to anxiety and depression, such as avoiding others and being less exploratory. Acrylamide, by the way, is also found in burnt toast. And it has been linked previously to both obesity and cardiovascular disease as well. It basically produces inflammation in the body. It also may affect how the body regulates cholesterol, and high levels of cholesterol are associated with anxiety and depression. Bizarre stuff. So now you know. Fresh fruit and veggies, huh? Avoid those fried foods. Chuck in Coldwater, Missouri. Hey, Chuck, thanks for listening to Sirius XM. What's on your mind today?
Hi, Tom. Hi, everybody. We have to fight for our voting rights. And on the subject of supermajorities, whether it be the Supreme Court or whatever, anytime you have a 60 or a two-thirds majority required, you take the value of one man's yes vote is only worth half of a no vote. And so it's totally unfair to do that. And now unanimous is different. You want the Supreme Court to be unanimous, or say, for instance, in a criminal case where you want the jury to be unanimous, that's a different issue. But when it takes two yes votes to equal one no vote, it's just unfair, and it takes away from our supreme right of one man, one vote. Here in Missouri, they're trying to change the initiative petition process to require it be a supermajority to pass a constitutional amendment. And the reason they're doing that is because the majority of people support abortion rights, and they're afraid they're going to put it on the ballot with an initiative petition to protect it.
Right, and that's only half of it, Chuck. Not only that, one of the things that we know from the marijuana wars is that when you put pot on the ballot, it increases Democratic voter turnout and increases the probability that Republicans lose their elections. And I'm sure that the same would be true of abortion. So it's not just that they're afraid that abortion being on the ballot will legalize abortion or avoid criminalizing it. It's also that it helps Democrats. Chuck, thank you. Amen. I totally get what you're saying. It's 27 minutes past the hour. We'll be back with your calls on the other side of the break here in the Thom Hartmann Program, the place where despair and fried foods are not an option.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
Yes, let's not discuss my French fry habit. We'll be right back. Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is the second, Race and Guns in a Fatally Unequal America by Carol Anderson. This is from the introduction. It was like a snuff film, that July 6th, 2016 live stream. Philando Castile sat in his car, buckled in, bleeding, dying. "Why did you shoot him, sir?" asked his fiancée, Diamond Reynolds, pain piercing her every word. Castile, who had been pulled over in a suburb of St. Paul, Minnesota, because his quote, wide-set nose, end quote, supposedly resembled that of a robbery suspect, had been reaching for his ID, but in order to avoid any surprises, let the police officer know he had a gun with him, a legally permitted, right-to-carry concealed gun. That was all the cop needed to know. Officer Geronimo Yanez began shooting. Castile's death came just one day after Alton Sterling's down in Louisiana. He, too, was carrying a gun, which was not unusual in this right-to-carry state. Granted, Sterling had a felony conviction, so owning a firearm was, for him, illegal, but he had been robbed before and wanted protection. On July 5th, 2016, the Baton Rouge police received a 911 call that there was a man with a weapon threatening customers at a local convenience store. As officers rolled onto the scene, they saw Sterling sitting there, selling CDs and DVDs, just as the store owner allowed him to do and indeed welcomed. The threatening man was not Sterling. In fact, there was no threatening man. It had been a prank call, but that didn't matter. Within a few minutes, police had thrown the black man down, pinned him to the asphalt, and then started yelling that Sterling had a gun. He did. It was in his pocket where he could hardly reach it, what with the officers squatting on both his legs and one arm. Nevertheless, the police began firing round after round into his prone body, point blank. Blood poured out of his chest. But not for long.
Alton Sterling was dead. The back-to-back deaths of these two black men police had shot for carrying guns should have jolted into action the Second Amendment's staunchest advocate, the National Rifle Association. In 1995, for example, the organization's denunciations flew fast and furious when it contended that law enforcement not only overreacted, but went out of its way to kill gun owners. Angered by the deaths at the Branch Davidian compound in Waco, Texas, and the siege and firefight at Ruby Ridge, Idaho, both of which were sparked by federal agents serving warrants for weapons violations, Wayne LaPierre, the NRA's executive vice president, angrily wrote, quote, "If you have a badge, you have the government's go-ahead to harass, intimidate, and even murder law-abiding citizens," end quote. He further denounced cops as, quote, "jackbooted government thugs who have more power to take away our constitutional rights, break in our doors, seize our guns, destroy our property, and even injure or kill us." Nearly 2 decades later, that sentiment had not changed. This was evident when Nevada rancher Cliven Bundy, who had refused to pay over $1 million in fees for grazing his cattle on public land, summoned his gun-toting, self-styled militiamen to do battle with federal authorities to prevent the seizure of his herd for restitution. Richard Mack, a former recipient of the NRA's Law Enforcement Officer of the Year award, asserted, "If federal agents are going to start killing people, I'm sorry, but to show the world how ruthless these people are, women and children need to be placed in the front lines as human shields." Mack didn't flinch as he insisted, quote, "Women need to be the first ones shot. I would have put my own wife or daughter there on the front lines, and I would have been a screaming bloody murder to watch them die," end quote. Larry Pratt, a speaker at the NRA's 2014 National Convention, commenting on the fact that Bundy, quote, "backed them," the Bureau of Land Management agents, down with automatic rifles and other deadly weaponry, proudly called that armed confrontation, quote, "a proper, legitimate, lawful response to illegitimate, unlawful exercise of government power, particularly on the federal level," end quote. Yet how quickly the NRA's swagger disappeared when government agents gunned down Philando Castile and Alton Sterling for merely carrying guns. Sterling's death didn't even merit acknowledgement. As for Castile, the NRA broke its silence only after inordinate pressure from African-American members led the gun manufacturers' lobby to issue a tepid statement that the Second Amendment was applicable, quote, "regardless of race, religion, or sexual orientation." When pressed further by many of its members to stand up for Castile, the often fierce organization demurred, saying it was, quote, "important for the NRA not to comment while the investigation is ongoing." This situational silence did not go unnoticed. The NRA had not only loudly defended the rights of those at the Branch Davidian cult and at Ruby Ridge, men who had actually shot and killed members of law enforcement, but the organization had also doubled down on calling for more guns in the face of mass shootings in a public school in Newtown, Connecticut, and a movie theater in Aurora, Colorado. Yet here, the guardian of the Second Amendment was now deliberately ignoring the inconvenient fact that black men had been killed for merely possessing a firearm. "Where's the NRA?" asked journalist Hannah Kozlowska. "Didn't Sterling and Philando Castile have Second Amendment rights too?" David Graham in The Atlantic coolly observed that, quote, "two shootings give a strong sense that the Second Amendment does not apply to black Americans the same way it does to white Americans," end quote. Washington Post columnist Eugene Robinson wrote that he saw the old Jim Crow whites only sign plastered above the Second Amendment. The book, The Second, by Carol Anderson. Want to know what's coming up on the next program? Want to know what I talked about in the last program? It's all over at THOM.TV. That's THOM.TV, Tom.TV. When I was a little kid, my grandmother had a piano, and I loved to play it. I was incompetent, but I was figuring out all kinds of stuff. And then I kind of got away from it, and, went to school, and things got busy, and just lost track of it. Well, now there's this fascinating new study out of the University of Geneva, Switzerland, that is making me think maybe I should go back and learn the piano. What they found was that they took a group of 132 healthy older adults, retired 62 to 78 years old. Half of them learned the piano, half of them took music classes without learning the piano.
And what they found was that those who learned the piano actually had the strongest increase in their memory, in their mental competence, their mental faculties. Those who took the music classes also did well, but learning the piano was a huge step. So check it out. There's a whole video about it with all the details over at tom.tv. 35 minutes past the hour, picking up your calls here. Jim in Kerrville, Texas. Hey, Jim, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Tom. You have a wonderful program. I have a question. I don't know that it has an easy answer, but I'd sure love to have your thoughts. For the last 50 years, we've off and on had Democrat presidents who were at the very least left of center, as I am, and we've had the opportunity to having both the Senate majority and the House of Representative majorities, we could have stopped the biggest detriment to democracy known as the Electoral College. That could have been abolished. Why, I ask, haven't they even attempted to do it? Your thoughts on that, sir?
Yeah, in the last, I'm trying to think of who was president. I'm pretty sure it was 1977. Fact check me on this, Jim, but my recollection, it's been, I wrote about this in The Hidden History of the War on Voting, but I wrote that book 3 years ago. I think it was 77, might have been 76 or 75, but right around that time, we came within one vote of abolishing the Electoral College, of amending the Constitution and getting a constitutional amendment passed in the Senate. It had already passed the House, and to end the Electoral College. And there was a broad consensus. Democrats and Republicans both thought that it was an anachronism whose time was past. Since then, you've had several Republican presidents who only won because of the Electoral College. Most recently,
Correct.
George W. Bush and Donald Trump. And I believe that there was another Republican who only won because of the Electoral College, but I could be wrong. I think George Herbert Walker Bush. But in any case, because of that, it has now become a totally partisan issue. And it takes, to amend the Constitution, doesn't require a simple majority or even a 60% threshold like to overcome a filibuster. You have to have 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate, and then it has to be ratified by 3/4 of the states. And so no Democrat has brought this forward since then because it would just be a futile effort. There's no possibility that a Republican will. Republicans view the Electoral College as the one and only way they get to be in the White House. I mean, if it wasn't for the Electoral College, you wouldn't have had the Bush presidency. You wouldn't have had presidency. You would have right now at least a 7-vote majority, or a 6-vote majority anyway, for sure, on the Supreme Court of Democratic appointees rather than Republicans. America would be a very different country right now if it wasn't for the Electoral College. And the Republicans know it.
Just as a quick caveat thought to what you just said, you might find this perhaps amusing. A friend of mine, in this discussion we're having, his comment was, my goodness, if you eliminate the Electoral College and have strictly a popular vote, we'll have mob rule.
Right.
And as humorous as that may be, and it is, the thing that's not humorous about it is I believe an awful lot of people think that.
I know. This is the pitch that Republicans are making these days to defend both the Electoral College and gerrymandering, which is that we're not a democracy, we're a republic, that democracy is mob rule, that we are instead a government of laws, not men. I mean, it's just a mishmash of quotes from former founders and things like that, and makes no sense. But the bottom line is democracy is mob rule, and but it's mob rule in a good way, not a bad way.
Yes. Sir, you're wonderful. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Jim. Thanks for the call, and thanks for watching us on Free Speech TV. I appreciate that. Scott in Burien, Washington. Hey, Scott, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom, you were talking about DeSantis earlier.
And you notice in the bobblehead video why he actually never said that he's running? Because Florida has a run or resign law where if he actually said that, even though you don't know if there actually has to be paperwork filed to trigger it, but basically in summary, if you're running for president under Florida law, you have to resign as governor. That's the main reason why there has been a court
And the
law.
Republicans are trying to change that law, by the way. There's a bill to end that right now in the Florida legislature.
Well, I mean, he's done everything but officially announced. It's just a total sham.
Yeah.
If it was the opposite way around where a Democrat was doing that, you'd bet they forced him to resign.
You betcha.
So,
yep.
you know.
I think you're absolutely right, Scott. And what's going to be interesting is to see how deep the support for DeSantis is, because the one way that the Trump humpers among the GOP, the Florida legislators, who would favor Trump over DeSantis, one of the ways that they can really stick it to DeSantis is to refuse to pass that legislation. So it's going to be a very interesting election this year. Scott, thank you for the call. Roberta in Maple Grove, Minnesota. Hey, Roberta, what's on your mind today?
Well, I just was harking back to when you said that the one thing that Trump did, he was a good, or maybe it wasn't you. I don't know. I get things confused, but I heard that, the one thing he excelled at was real estate.
Yeah, I said, in his business career, as far as I can tell, the only business that he still owns is his real estate empire. Let me put it that way. He's failed at everything else.
Yeah, well, I don't think that he, I don't straight stack him up for other people in real estate, and I think he's laundering money all these years.
I agree.
I can't get over, the banks giving him loan after millions of dollars and everything. He's been laundering money. He's been in the back pocket of Russia for years.
I agree.
And I do you remember when it was during the election and they found a server in Trump Towers, Trump Tower that was.
There was pinging Alpha Bank, a Russian bank.
Yes. Where did that go?
That investigation died at the hands of Bill Barr.
Oh man.
I know. There's so many of these investigations. I mean, so many potential prosecutions for that matter that Trump appointee Christopher Wray, head of the FBI, has not pursued, and Orrin Hatch suggested appointee Merrick Garland has decided not to pursue. I think Trump's getting away with murder here. I mean, probably legally, probably literally, but certainly metaphorically, he's getting away with murder, and has been for years and years and years. And it's a bunch of his own appointees and Republicans. It's just very disappointing. Roberta, thank you for the call. Joe in Madison, Wisconsin. Hey, thanks for listening to WMAD. What's up?
Just wanted to make a point in response to a caller previous hour who was speaking about the British royal family and described them as some of the worst people on earth. I wanted to push back a little bit on that. Just 2 points that I'd offer. I think it's worth doing a little bit more research before jumping to that conclusion. 2 things. How does one accomplish power? And the issue of soft power in terms of the British monarchy is a really interesting one. I would offer as an example the Prince Charles and what he's done on the Duchess of Cornwall, which when he first took it over was really teetering on the brink of bankruptcy. He brought it back, this is back in the 1980s, by focusing on organic and sustainable agriculture on this land. And what he did was, people laughed at him. They said, this nutty guy and his organic stuff. Within 5 years, he had created a business off this 1,000 acres that went organic on this Duchy of Cornwall land. That 1990, it's called Duchy Originals. It's the largest organic food company within the British Isles, and he used invested that money back into back into the public. But more importantly, he provided an example way back in 1990 saying, look, you can grow things organically, make money, and there's a market for this. It's a huge thing that he was able to do. In addition, he's had enormous amounts of wind power, solar, sustainability on the Cornwall estate because he's trying to show, look, you can live this way and do it in an economic and sustainable way. So I would offer that as an example of soft power. And I know your time is short, so I'll just have one last one, and that is what Queen Elizabeth was able to accomplish through the Commonwealth, which some regard as just, it's just leftover empire. Not at all. 1/3. I got very interested in this because the president of Gabon, which joined the Commonwealth, was irate that anyone would think that he didn't have merit in joining that. And that's a French colony. That's not a British colony. He said, for us, it's a huge economic, cultural, and political alliance. And the stat that stayed in my mind, Tom, was that 1/3 of the world's population are members of the Commonwealth. And so your countries from India to Pakistan to Canada to many countries within Africa. And what Elizabeth was able to accomplish by using soft power, for example, she said that when Nelson Mandela was in such terrible straits, jailed and the apartheid ruled his country, she was the one who said, okay, South Africa, if you're going to be an apartheid country, you can't be part of the Commonwealth. You lose all of what the Commonwealth is about. And Nelson Mandela was so grateful for what she had done in terms of soft power, pushing that through, that they became very fast friends. He was invited up to her home, stayed there many times, and was such a good pal of hers that he didn't even refer to her as Your Majesty or Ma'am. It was a relationship where he called her Elizabeth. That's a kind of political and personal connections she was able to push forward. And I would argue that that same kind of soft power continues. I read just a couple of weeks ago that the Prince William went to Poland recently, in part to sort of shore up support for what's going on in Ukraine. But while he was there, Poland is a very conservative Catholic country and not too friendly to gay people. He made a point, after all of the diplomatic stuff he did, he made a point of going to a small restaurant in Poland that's very friendly to gay people, and bought himself an $8 bowl of soup and made a point out of photos being taken of him at this restaurant to indicate his support for gay, lesbian, trans people in that country. Right. So I think it's too easy to just dump out and just say there's some of the worst people on earth. Let's look and see how change happens and how they are able to contribute to it.
Joe, you make an eloquent defense of the current British royal family. But speaking to the institution, I mean, what if it wasn't Elizabeth and Charles, who I also have tremendous respect for, both of them? What if it was Henry VIII? I mean, what if Elizabeth was behaving more like her great-great-great-grandfather rather than herself? What if her son was behaving more like, Richard II? I mean, what if they were, violent warlords and aligning themselves with Nazis and fascists rather than decent people? Doesn't the institution itself give you pause?
I think that you can look at constitutional monarchies around Europe. There are constitutional monarchies in Denmark, in Norway, in Sweden, in Spain. When you have a constitutional monarchy, different ways of... So sure. Let's look at that, and maybe that's something worth returning to. People can get rid of them. They haven't. The people haven't voted them out. How come? What are they getting out of them?
In all cases, they have been mostly stripped of any power. I mean, arguably the British royal family has more political power than any of the other countries you mentioned. But okay, I'm relatively neutral on this issue. Joe, thanks a lot for the call.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
It's 48 minutes past the hour. Back with your calls in just a moment. It's the Thom Hartmann Program, fair and only slightly unbalanced. And welcome back. Dwayne in Petaluma, California. Hey, Dwayne, what's on your mind today?
3 quick points, if I may. To deal with the Electoral College, just double the representatives in the House. The House can do it by majority vote. It eliminates the advantage that the small states have.
Would that not require a constitutional amendment?
No, the House sets its own number. It's already in the Constitution.
Oh, you're right. You're right. Okay.
Second thing, unstack the Supreme Court. Have a Democratic president with a Democratic Senate. Appoint 9 additional liberal Supreme Court members.
Yeah, you'd have to get past a filibuster to do that, but yes, I'm all in favor of it.
They would attempt to filibuster, and the Democrats would have to deal with that. And third, the 13th Amendment prohibits involuntary servitude. How's being forced to carry the child of a rapist not involuntary servitude?
Well, that's a question that could only be answered right now by the Supreme Court.
No,
and I think you have their
that's
answer.
Not true at all. To come to enforce for a person from Texas to come to collect money at a court in Texas because somebody had gotten an abortion in California, they filed a lawsuit under the Texas law or Florida law. To come here to enforce slavery would be a felony. We should arrest anybody who comes here to attempts to enforce a judgment.
Well, yeah. I mean, philosophically, I don't disagree with you. I don't think that there's any legal precedent, though, for what you're arguing.
And the next point would be Trump gave aid and comfort to the people who were attempting to destroy our democracy. It prohibits him, as Robert Reich said, it prohibits him from serving. In California, to pass a law that says you can't put Trump's name on the ballot.
Have they passed that law?
They need to.
Oh, yeah.
We need somebody to advocate that we prohibit a person who gave aid and comfort to the enemy to be on the ballot.
Explicitly.
And their electors should be prohibited from serving.
Yeah. I mean, the 14th Amendment is fairly clear on this. If you have attempted to overthrow or engaged in or even supported an insurrection against the government of the United States, you are not eligible for election to any public office, any federal public office, and actually any public office nationwide. And what baffles me is why Trump is not being, why the Democratic Party is not aggressively going after Trump in this regard.
But to enforce that, you would either have it go through the courts, or you would have California simply pass a law that says you can't be on the ballot if you've.
But if Trump's not on the ballot in California, and loses California, how is that going to change the outcome of the election? He lost California before.
It gives an example for what should happen in Georgia after he's found guilty of crime in Georgia.
But Georgia's not going to pass that law.
Refused to seat Trump. They're not. That'd be interesting to see, but there could be.
I mean, you're going to have to find a state that Trump has won that's willing to say, he violated the 14th Amendment, therefore we're not going to let him run. And I just can't. I can't think of any state that would qualify for that, including Georgia, which is getting more purple. But points made. Keep thinking, Dwayne. Some good stuff there. Thank you very much for the call. It's 52 minutes past the hour. We'll be back with more of your calls in just a moment. Stay tuned. Help support Progressive Radio. If you're listening to us on a commercial station, call their advertisers and let them know you're listening. If you're listening to us on Pacifica, one of our many nonprofit stations, please support them when they do their fundraising drives. Thanks for supporting Progressive Talk Radio and tag you're it. So we have this major culture war going on in the United States. You've got Republicans trying to ban abortion. They're trying to ban books. Not just trying to, they're actually doing all of these things. Banning books, banning trans girls in sports, attacking basically the entire queer community, whatever they can to try to sow division and hate, promoting Nazi memes, talking about how, Jews are paying to have black and brown people replace white people and all this kind of stuff. Why are billionaires doing this? Why are they funding these people? I mean, billionaires don't care about crime. They live in gated communities with private security. They don't care about public schools. Their kids go to private schools. They don't care about public transportation. They fly in private jets. Oh, yeah, that's right. If they can get us fighting against each other, if they can get us hating each other,
We will ignore their efforts to cut their taxes and deregulate their industries. There's a whole video about it at tom.tv. Check it out. Welcome back. Picking up your calls here. Carol in Pontiac, Michigan. Hey, Carol, what's on your mind today?
Yeah, hi, Tom. Hope I get this right. You had a guy on there earlier talking about the Electoral College.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a term that was being used, which is mob rule.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a messaging issue because wouldn't it be populist rule?
Yeah, arguably. Sure.
And that sounds more favorable than mob rule, which sounds like an angry crew of people that take over and overthrow the government.
That's why it's been used as a slur. I mean, this goes back to the founding of the Republic. When Hamilton and Madison were trying to sell the Constitution, they were trash-talking democracy, something that's echoed frequently by Republicans nowadays, because they were creating a representative democratic republic as opposed to a pure democratic republic. In other words, we elect representatives and they represent us. We do it through a democratic process, elections, winner takes all.
It's not winner takes all, though, is it?
I beg your pardon?
It's not winner takes all. It would be.
It is.
Mob.
No, it is. If you get 51% of the vote, you are elected to the Senate or the House or whatever, dog catcher, whatever it may be.
Well, everything except the Electoral College, right?
Yeah. Well, even with the Electoral College, if you get a majority of the Electoral College, you become president. The problem is that the Electoral College doesn't track with the popular vote.
Yes, not the popular vote.
Right.
And I think most people, if we start turning that around and saying it in a different way, like your teams win by winning. It's the guy that has.
No, you're right. Mob rule is a cheap slur, and it has been for years, and it's one that's used mostly by Republicans to describe democracy. So, Carol, I got to run, but thank you for the call, and thanks for listening to the program. Thank you for being with us today. We'll be back tomorrow, same time, same place. In the meantime, please don't forget, democracy is not a spectator sport. It doesn't work without all of us. We need the demos in democracy is people. That's you and me. So get out there, get active, tag you're it. Make sure that you're registered to vote. Make sure your friends are registered to vote. And if you live in a red state, double and triple check your voter registration over and over again, because they are purging voters as we speak. So we'll see you tomorrow. Have a great afternoon. Be good to yourself and the people around you. You're it. I thought I already said that.
You've been listening to Thom Hartmann. For audio and video archives, visit thomhartmann.com.
We say fight back!
In addition to bringing you the Thom Hartmann Program here on Free Speech TV and Video Media Online, we also have a whole set of ways you can interact with us and tools you can use to spread the word about the importance of democracy and the threats to it in our republic. First, there's your daily homework. Sue Nethercutt puts together a daily email newsletter that has a link to every story I discuss on the air, so you can find my sources and you can share them with your friends. It's free and you can sign up at thomhartmann.com. Second, I publish my daily take every day over at the HartmannReport.com website. That's also free if you want the daily 5 days a week rant in your inbox. No ads either. Third, we have the podcasts. There's the free 1-hour version of our daily show that's advertising supported. You can find that wherever you get your podcasts normally. And then there's also the podcast of the entire 3-hour show with no advertisements, and that's available by subscription over at thomhartmann.com. So check them all out at thomhartmann.com and hartmannreport.com.